Before you close your eyes tonight, take a moment to let your breath slow and your mind soften. Imagine the quiet streets of old London, wrapped in gentle fog under glowing gas lamps. Picture the warm sitting room of Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes sits calmly by the fire, his violin resting by his side, as a quiet mystery unfolds in the shadows beyond. Tonight, let me tell you a story of hidden music, secret societies, and a melody so haunting it whispered its final notes only to those brave enough to listen. A gentle, immersive journey into a world of clues, candlelight, and calm suspense, designed to ease your thoughts, soothe your breath, and guide you into deep, restful sleep. So settle in, breathe deeply, and drift with me into the echo of Baker Street. It was a cold and quiet afternoon in November when the wind moved through Baker Street with a slow, chilly determination. The city was covered by a pale gray sky that pressed down upon the rooftops and blurred the outlines of the distant chimneys. In our sitting room, everything felt still and warm, as if the walls themselves were protecting us from the damp chill outside. Holmes was sitting by the window, his long legs crossed under his chair. The late daylight filtered through the thin curtains, washing his sharp features in a silver glow. He held his violin under his chin, bow moving gently across the strings. Each note he played was soft but deep, carrying an echo that filled the quiet room with an almost mournful peace. It was not a performance for anyone but himself, as if he was pulling each note from some place far away, a place only he could reach. I was in my usual chair by the hearth, leaning back with my eyes half closed. The fire burned low, releasing a calm warmth that seeped through the room and settled into my bones. The scent of oak wood smoke was faint but comforting, mixing with the older smells of leather-bound books, tobacco, and the woolen rugs under our feet. I listened to Holmes play, feeling each sound flow over me like water. The tension in my shoulders melted away with each note. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, keeping time in the background, while outside I could hear the occasional clip of a horse's hooves on wet cobblestone and the muted roll of distant carriage wheels. Holmes's playing slowed further, the melody growing even softer, almost whispering in the fading daylight. His eyes were half closed as he played, his mind somewhere far beyond the room, away from the dull colors of November, away from London itself. The music was calm and sorrowful, a quiet lament that spoke of lost days and memories left behind, yet it never felt heavy. It felt honest. Then, just as he was drawing his bow across the string for another gentle note, he stopped. The vibration of the string faded into silence. I opened my eyes fully and looked at him. His posture did not change, but his gaze shifted towards the door. At that same moment, a knock came. It was not loud or urgent. It was sharp and precise, 3 knocks that cut through the stillness with perfect clarity. For a moment, all sound seemed to disappear, leaving only the cold breath of wind against the window glass. Holmes lowered his violin slowly, placing it on the small table by his chair. His eyes remained fixed on the door, his expression unreadable. I could hear the faint creak of footsteps outside, and then the door opened softly. Mrs. Hudson peeked in, her kind face lined with concern. She did not step into the room, as if afraid to break whatever fragile peace we had built there that afternoon. She spoke in a gentle voice, careful not to disturb the atmosphere more than necessary. She said there was an inspector downstairs waiting to see Mr. Holmes about a case. Her eyes flickered with quiet worry before she closed the door again, leaving us alone in the fading light. Holmes rose from his chair in one smooth movement. He reached for his coat and hat from the hook near the fireplace. He paused for a moment, glancing at me with a calm seriousness. In that silence, the warmth of the room seemed to deepen, wrapping around us like an old blanket on a winter morning. The fire popped softly as it burned down to glowing embers. He said to me that there was nothing like an artist's death to show how twisted human nature could be. His voice was steady, low, and quiet, as if he was speaking more to himself than to me. I folded my newspaper carefully and placed it on the table beside my chair. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the wood, warm from the fire's heat. I stood up, feeling the gentle ache of my knees from sitting so long in one position. Outside the window, a lone crow flew across the gray sky toward the rooftops, its wings flapping slowly, black against the silver clouds. The street below was nearly empty, with only the fog beginning to roll in around the lampposts, turning the late afternoon into an early dusk. I reached for my walking cane by the door. The brass handle felt cool against my palm, grounding me in the moment. Holmes opened the door and stepped into the hallway. I followed, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. As we walked down the stairs towards the front entryway where the inspector waited, I felt the calm of the sitting room settle deeper inside me. Despite knowing we were about to face the darkness of death, mystery, and human greed, there was something peaceful in the simple routine of leaving our warm sanctuary to step out into the cold streets of London together. It was the beginning of another case, another path to walk at Holmes's side. Each footstep across the wooden floors echoed softly, matching the slow rhythm of my own breath. In that moment, there was no fear, only a calm readiness to see what lay ahead. The inspector's carriage moved through the damp streets with a low rattle, its wheels cutting twin paths in the thin film of rain that had begun to settle upon Fleet Street. The gas lamps burned with a quiet glow, their light bending and shimmering in the rising fog. London that afternoon felt half awake, as if the city itself was dozing under the cold breath of November, too weary to fully open its eyes. Holmes sat across from me in the carriage, silent and focused, his gray eyes staring into a distance that only he could see. The movement of the carriage made the shadows dance across his sharp features, creating fleeting masks of darkness and light upon his face. He remained perfectly still, gloved hands folded around the head of his cane, and I knew his mind was already at the crime scene, long before we arrived. When the carriage stopped with a gentle jolt, Holmes stepped out first. The inspector was waiting under a narrow awning by a low brick building with soot-darkened windows. His coat collar was turned up against the drizzle, and his hat brim dripped water in thin, steady drops. Holmes greeted him with a nod, his voice calm and polite, and together we followed him down a short flight of worn stone steps into the ground floor flat. The smell inside was the first thing that reached me. It was the cold smell of damp wood mixed with the bitter sweetness of rosin and the faint metallic edge of blood. The small sitting room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp on a narrow shelf by the window. Its flame flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows onto the peeling floral wallpaper. The dark red rug on the floor was thin and worn to its threads in places, showing the gray wood beneath. Arthur Maynard, the blind violinist, lay slumped beside an old, upright piano that pressed tightly against the back wall. His head rested against its side in an almost peaceful posture, as if he had simply fallen asleep mid-thought. His white shirt was stained deeply with blood from his neck, where a brutal final wound cut across his jugular. A bloody straight razor had slipped from his limp fingers and lay on the floor beside his open palm, its blade catching the lamplight with a dull, lifeless glint. The inspector stood silently by the door, his eyes shadowed under his hat brim. He said that the landlady had found the body earlier that morning when she came to deliver tea. Her teacup and small copper kettle sat on a tray near the doorway, untouched, the steam long gone cold by the time we arrived. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation. His shoes creaked lightly on the wooden floor as he moved closer to the body. The faint smell of decaying rosin rose from the violin case propped open near Maynard's chair, mingling with the sharper scent of drying blood. Holmes's face remained calm and composed, his gaze scanning the scene with slow, deliberate precision. I looked around the small flat. There was little furniture besides the upright piano, a narrow iron-framed bed in the corner with blankets folded neatly at the foot, a simple chair by the window, and a cracked porcelain wash basin resting atop a rickety stand. On the windowsill stood an old metronome, its wooden casing chipped at the corners, its brass pendulum frozen mid-swing, casting a long shadow onto the damp glass behind it. The violin itself rested across the piano's top, strings still glistening with fresh rosin dust under the lamp's glow. I noticed the curtains were thin and nearly transparent, moving lightly with each breath of the wind through the cracked frame. Outside, the street was quiet. Only the faint murmur of passing carriages and distant footsteps reached us here. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though the air was thickened by the sadness of what had occurred within these narrow walls. Holmes kneeled slowly by the body. I could hear the quiet creak of his coat as he bent forward, his long fingers hovering just above Maynard's blood-stained collar. He did not touch him yet. Instead, he remained there for a long moment, his eyes taking in the posture of the man's shoulders, the angle of his knees against the rug, the loose grip of his lifeless fingers around nothing but air. Behind us, the inspector cleared his throat softly, a nervous sound that barely rose above the gentle tapping of rain against the window glass. Holmes ignored him, and for a while the only sounds were the quiet rhythm of the rain, the ticking of the metronome's frozen pendulum as it cooled under the lamp's warmth, and our own breaths mingling with the cold, rosin-scented air. Finally, Holmes stood up. His eyes, bright with thought yet darkened by something deeper, flicked across the room once more before he turned to me. Without a word, he gestured for me to approach the body and perform my examination. His silence was not rushed or impatient. It carried the certainty of a man who knew that each step in truth-seeking required a calm mind and steady hands. I stepped forward and knelt down by Maynard's side, feeling the quiet sorrow of the scene settle into my chest. There was nothing violent in the way he lay there, only an unnatural stillness, like a melody cut off before the final note could resolve. For a brief moment, I almost believed he might open his sightless eyes and finish the phrase he had been playing before death claimed him. But the truth was written upon his cold skin and silent throat. His final performance was over, leaving only silence behind. I remained kneeling by the silent body of Arthur Maynard for some time, allowing the stillness of the room to seep into my senses before I began my examination. There was something profoundly sorrowful in the way his thin frame rested against the upright piano, as though he had leaned into it for support in his final moment. The piano itself, with its cracked lacquered wood and chipped keys, seemed to cradle him gently in death, its silent presence echoing the unfinished notes that would never again fill this narrow room. His head was tilted slightly forward, his chin resting near his chest, revealing the deep wound that cut across his jugular. The blood had soaked into the thin cotton of his white shirt, darkening it to a heavy maroon where it clung to his collarbone. The cut was precise, angled just below the jawline, ensuring a quick and final end. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or forearms. His palms were pale, with faint lines of rosin dust along his fingertips. I studied the straight razor lying beside his hand. Its blade was cleanly sharpened, the wooden handle worn smooth with years of use. A small brass plate on its side carried his initials, engraved in looping letters now tarnished with age. I let out a quiet sigh that seemed too loud in that silent room. The weight of wasted brilliance pressed upon me. This was a man who had lived his life surrounded by music despite the darkness of blindness. His fingertips told the story of his dedication, the calluses perfectly formed, the pads stained with fresh rosin, and the slight redness at his left index where he had pressed the strings too hard in recent days. The smell of rosin rose again, sharp and almost medicinal, mingling with the dull sweetness of old wood and the metallic scent of blood. Holmes stood behind me, silent, his shadow stretching long across the rug under the lamplight. I did not turn to look at him, but I felt his eyes upon every movement I made. I could almost hear the swift wheels of his mind turning, cataloging, discarding, connecting. But his presence remained still, offering no interruption, allowing me to complete my work with focus and care. I placed 2 fingers lightly against Maynard's cooling throat. His skin felt like damp paper, already sinking into the first quiet stages of death's journey. There was no warmth left there, no flicker of life hidden beneath the skin. I checked his pulse points, though I knew there would be none, and looked carefully at the angle of the wound. The blade had cut cleanly and deeply with a single sweep. There was no hesitation mark, no second attempt. Whoever had done this, if it was done by another hand, had not allowed for mistakes. I looked at Maynard's face for a long moment. His closed eyes were calm, his thin lips parted slightly, as if caught mid-breath. His hair was neatly combed back, with strands of gray among the black, curling slightly against the dampness of his skin. There was a trace of old aftershave along his jawline, the scent faint, but still present, beneath the stronger odors of the room. His chin bore the small nicks of a recent shave, suggesting he had prepared himself for his day with care, not with despair. I spoke softly into the silence, my words carrying no expectation of reply. Poor soul! There is no greater tragedy than a brilliant mind lost to its own darkness. My voice felt heavy in my throat. Death was a presence I had faced often as a military doctor, but the death of an artist always carried a particular sadness. It was as if the music they held within them died twice, once with their body and again with the silence that followed. Holmes did not answer me. His silence was not dismissive. It was contemplative, layered with meaning that he chose not to reveal yet. I felt his gaze shift away from me, moving across the small flat. I followed the angle of his attention and saw that his eyes were fixed upon the window. The glass was streaked with the faint trails of rain, the thin curtains drifting slightly in the cold breeze that slipped through a narrow crack in the frame. Beyond the window, the alley behind the building was dim, shadows gathering among the discarded crates and rusted metal bins that lined its length. Holmes stepped forward quietly, his shoes making only the softest creak on the worn boards. He reached out and touched the window frame with his gloved fingertips, as though feeling for something only he could sense. Then he turned his head slightly towards me, his profile outlined by the lamplight. His expression remained calm, but his eyes burned with quiet purpose. In that still moment, with the silent body of Arthur Maynard beside us and the rain falling gently against the window glass, I felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. What had begun as a tragic end was becoming something else. A question had entered Holmes's mind, and where there were questions, there would always be answers waiting to be revealed, hidden in the quiet corners of London where only he dared to look. Holmes did not move for several moments as he stood by the window, his tall frame outlined by the faint light slipping between the thin curtains. The quiet of the small flat pressed around us, filled only with the distant murmur of passing carriages outside and the gentle tap of rain against the glass. I remained kneeling beside Maynard's body, feeling the calm sadness of his silent form settle heavily into my chest. Finally, Holmes reached out with slow precision and unlatched the window. The metal catch made a soft click as it released, and he pushed the glass upward just enough to allow the damp evening air to drift inside. The scent of wet stone and rotting autumn leaves replaced the metallic tang of blood for a moment, bringing with it a quiet chill that made the thin curtains ripple gently. Holmes leaned forward, placing one hand on the windowsill as he studied the narrow alley outside. The alley stretched between this building and the next, lined with old crates stacked haphazardly, their wood darkened and swollen from years of rain. Water dripped from the roof edge above, landing in tiny rippling pools that had formed in the shallow dips of the dirt path below. Then I saw what he had noticed. Just below the window, pressed into the wet earth, were a series of footprints. They were perfectly visible in the dim glow from a distant street lamp at the alley's mouth, each mark outlined sharply in the damp dirt. Holmes remained silent as he studied them, his eyes scanning their size, the depth of the impressions, the slight smudge where a heel had twisted against the ground. He drew in a slow, steady breath, and his voice came low and calm, almost a whisper that merged seamlessly with the quiet of the room. "Look here, Watson. Someone stood here for some time." His words did not carry surprise. Instead, they carried that same deep certainty I had come to know so well, as though he was merely confirming what he had already deduced long before. I stood and moved closer, careful not to disturb anything within the room. The alley smelled of damp earth and rust, tinged with the sour scent of old rubbish left to soften in the rain. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I could see clearly the shape of the footprints. They were neither large nor small, perhaps belonging to an average man, though their edges were softened by the constant drizzle. Holmes reached out with his gloved hand and touched the inside of the window frame, where a faint smudge of dirt marked the painted wood. It was a thin streak no larger than the width of a thumbprint, but it told its own story. Holmes remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed yet focused. His breathing was quiet and even, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had paused around him. The only movement was the slow dripping of water from the roof edge above and the gentle shifting of the thin curtains around his shoulders. His eyes traced the footprints once more before he let the window fall back into place with a soft thud that vibrated through the silent room. He turned towards me then, his face calm, composed, and thoughtful. In the quiet lamplight, his expression carried no alarm or urgency. Instead, there was a profound attentiveness in the lines of his brow and the stillness of his mouth. He was listening to the clues, not with his ears, but with the part of his mind that lived in spaces between words, footsteps, and silences. Without speaking, Holmes stepped past me to kneel once more beside Maynard's body. His fingers hovered above the violinist's cold hand, studying the faint stains of rosin dust and the worn tips of his calloused fingers. The peaceful posture of the dead man against the piano, the razor's careful placement beside his open hand, and now the silent witness of footprints in the alleyway. Each piece settled into Holmes's mind with quiet certainty, like notes falling into place within a hidden melody. Outside, the distant bells of St. Bride's rang the hour, their muffled chimes drifting through the foggy streets and settling gently over Fleet Street. In that small, dim room, filled with the scent of rosin, blood, and rain, I felt the mystery deepen around us like the gathering shadows of dusk. Holmes remained kneeling, silent and unmoving, his eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight as he began to follow the invisible path left behind by the unknown watcher outside the window. Holmes rose from his silent examination by the window, his movements unhurried and fluid. The quiet weight of the room seemed to follow him as he stepped back towards the piano where Maynard's body remained slumped. His gaze moved with patient precision over the narrow top of the upright instrument, pausing upon a thin sheet of paper half tucked beneath a cracked porcelain metronome. He reached out and lifted it with the utmost care, his gloved fingers sliding under the damp corner so as not to smudge the ink that darkened the stained page. The lamplight revealed the sheet's condition in full. Its edges were browned with time and moisture, and a faint fingerprint marked its bottom margin, smudged in what looked like rosin, or perhaps dried blood. Holmes held the page up before him and studied it without a word. I watched from beside the window, noting the way his eyes moved from line to line, reading not merely the musical notes printed upon the staff, but the meaning hidden between them. The paper quivered slightly in the faint draft drifting through the cracked window frame, making the thin ink lines flicker under the lamplight. Finally, he spoke in a voice so calm it nearly merged with the quiet tick of the cooling metronome. The notes are reversed. See here, Watson, where this D has been flipped backwards, and here, this F, mirrored entirely. His fingertip traced each altered note in turn with slow precision, the way a scholar might read the letters of an ancient inscription. His tone carried no excitement or alarm, only a steady, knowing certainty, as though he had already anticipated what he would find. I stepped forward to look closer. The music on the page was a simple violin melody, perhaps an exercise or an unfinished composition, but now I could see the oddities he pointed out. At first glance, they seemed like printing errors or the mistakes of a blind man writing without sight. Yet as Holmes studied each reversed note, his brow furrowed with focused intent. The room felt utterly still, as though the air itself had paused to listen to the quiet rustle of paper in his hands. He folded the sheet gently and slipped it into an evidence envelope he pulled from his inner coat pocket, pressing out the air before sealing it with precise movements. The soft click of the metal clasp echoed faintly in the silence of the room. For a moment, he held the envelope before him, looking down at it with that same distant focus in his gray eyes, seeing far beyond the damp walls of this small flat. "This is no accident, Watson. It is a message." His words settled quietly into the room, joining the drifting scent of rosin, old wood, and the faint metallic whisper of blood. Outside the window, rain continued to fall in a gentle mist over Fleet Street, tapping lightly against the glass as if in approval of his discovery. Holmes slipped the envelope into his coat pocket, turned towards Maynard's silent body, and regarded him with an expression of calm, searching respect. In that moment, watching Holmes stand there in the quiet glow of the lamp with the sealed envelope hidden safely within his coat, I felt the mystery deepen around us once again. It was as if an unseen hand had just added a dissonant note to an unfinished melody, a note that could never be ignored or forgotten until its meaning was fully revealed. Inspector Lestrade stood near the door of the small flat, his hat held tightly between his gloved hands, its brim bent slightly from the nervous pressure of his grip. He shifted his weight from foot to foot as Holmes finished slipping the coded music sheet into his coat pocket. The inspector's narrow shoulders were tense under his heavy wool coat, his collar still wet with the thin drizzle that fell relentlessly outside. Holmes turned to him with calm expectation, and Lestrade cleared his throat softly before he spoke, his voice carrying the weary cadence of a man who had spent his entire morning among the quiet sadness of death. He began to recount what little they knew. Arthur Maynard had lived here for the last 12 years, ever since his eyesight failed completely. As a young boy, Lestrade said, Maynard had shown great promise with the violin, studying under respected teachers in small community schools across South London. But an illness had taken his sight before he reached his teenage years, and the promising future his family once imagined narrowed into something smaller, though not without beauty. I watched Lestrade as he spoke, noting how his eyes flicked from Holmes to me and back again, searching for any hint of reaction that might guide his telling. His voice dropped lower as he described Maynard's adult life. He had no living family. His father, a house painter, had died in an accident on scaffolding when Maynard was still a boy. His mother, a seamstress who worked late into the evenings by candlelight to keep them fed after his blindness, passed when he was barely 20, leaving him alone in their small rented room until he moved here, closer to Fleet Street, where the busier squares offered him better chances of earning coins with his playing. Lestrade shifted the hat in his hands again. His gaze moved towards the silent body by the piano, his brow creasing faintly with an emotion I could not quite place. Perhaps pity, perhaps weary resignation. Maynard, he continued, earned his small living performing in coffee houses and public gardens during the milder months, though in the colder seasons he often played under the awnings along Fleet Street. He would stand quietly with his old violin resting upon his shoulder, his empty eyes closed as his bow moved back and forth, weaving simple folk melodies and solemn hymns into the city's hum. Passers-by dropped coins into the wooden cigar box he set at his feet, a box worn smooth along its edges from years of being carried and opened countless times. Holmes stood silent and still, his posture relaxed yet alert, absorbing every detail without any visible reaction. I could see his eyes flickering with thought as Lestrade spoke, though his expression remained composed, offering the inspector no hint of his deductions. Outside the open window, the muffled sound of a distant church bell drifted into the quiet room, chiming the hour in low, measured tones that blended with the soft rhythm of falling rain. Lestrade's voice grew softer as he described Maynard's reputation among local merchants and coffeehouse owners. He was known as a gentle man with quiet manners. Though blind, he carried himself with an understated dignity, always wearing a clean white shirt and dark wool trousers neatly pressed, held by old, polished suspenders. Some days he wore a faded gray hat, pulled low over his brow, even though he could no longer see the sun. Others said he preferred to stand bareheaded, letting the faint warmth of early morning light fall across his lined forehead before the city clouds rolled in to cover the sky once again. The inspector paused for a moment, glancing around the small flat as though taking in its sparse furnishings for the first time. His eyes settled briefly on the cracked porcelain basin in the corner, the thin towel draped carefully over its edge, the chipped cup resting upside down upon a small folded cloth. His gaze moved to the simple iron bed frame, its mattress thin and neatly made, the single wool blanket tucked squarely at its foot. A pair of worn leather shoes rested side by side beneath the bed, soles smooth and darkened by years of silent steps across stone, dirt, and polished floorboards. Lestrade took a slow, steady breath before continuing. Maynard, he said, had no living relatives. His only sister, who had cared for him in his late teenage years, died nearly 20 years ago from consumption. Since then, he had lived alone, relying on the kindness of neighbors for small errands and using his keen memory to navigate London's winding streets. Occasionally, he earned small coins by giving music lessons to young apprentices who wished to study violin but could not afford formal instruction. He would sit with them in this very room, tapping their knuckles lightly with his bow when they misplaced a finger, correcting them by ear with a patience born of years spent listening instead of seeing. Holmes's eyes softened for the briefest of moments as he listened, though his calm expression did not change. He walked slowly towards the piano, letting his gloved fingertips brush across its cracked wooden surface. The touch was so light it made no sound, yet it felt to me as though he was reading the story of Maynard's life through the silent vibrations left behind upon the keys and wood. Lestrade fell silent then, his report complete. The room settled back into its quiet heaviness, filled only with the faint creak of floorboards as Holmes moved to stand by the piano stool. Outside, a carriage rolled slowly past, the muffled clatter of its wheels blending with the gentle rain to create a soothing rhythm that filled the narrow alley beyond the window. I felt a deep ache in my chest as I looked once more at Maynard's peaceful face. Here was a man who had carved out a life in darkness, one note at a time, building small joys upon quiet struggles, only for that music to end without warning in this lonely room. But as I watched Holmes standing there, utterly calm and composed, I knew this was not merely a sad story of poverty and death. It was the first page of a deeper mystery that had only just begun to reveal its hidden notes. Holmes remained by the piano for several quiet moments after Lestrade finished his report, his tall frame leaning slightly as he rested one hand upon the cracked wood. His gaze drifted across the silent room from the stained rug to the blood-streaked collar of Maynard's white shirt, and then back to the footprints outside the open window. The silence was not empty. It felt charged with hidden threads of thought weaving themselves together in his mind. Then there was a gentle knock at the door. Lestrade turned quickly, his polished boots squeaking softly against the wooden floorboards. A young constable stepped inside, holding his helmet under one arm with respectful caution. He glanced first at the inspector, then at Holmes, before speaking in a low, steady voice that blended with the quiet room. "There is a woman from upstairs waiting outside, sir. She says she heard something last night and wishes to speak to whoever is in charge." Holmes turned his head slightly, his expression remaining calm, but his eyes sharpening with interest. Without a word, he stepped away from the piano and crossed the small room with smooth, silent strides. As he passed me, I caught the subtle scent of his wool coat, dampened by the earlier drizzle outside, mixed with the faintest trace of tobacco that clung to his lapels from our morning by the fire. Outside in the narrow hallway stood an elderly woman dressed in a simple navy wool coat, buttoned up to her chin, a knitted gray scarf wrapped twice around her thin neck. Wisps of white hair escaped from beneath her felt hat, curling softly around her lined cheeks. She held a small wicker basket with both hands, the handles worn smooth from years of use, and her pale blue eyes flickered nervously as Holmes approached. Holmes greeted her with calm courtesy, inclining his head slightly as he gestured for her to speak. She looked up at him with a hesitant expression, her gloved fingers tightening around the basket handle as she drew in a slow, careful breath. "I live in the flat just above his, sir," she began, her voice trembling lightly with age, yet clear in its sincerity. "I could hear him playing last night, sometime near midnight, I believe. It was piano music, very soft, almost like he was practicing a hymn or a funeral piece. She paused then, her eyes drifting to the door behind Holmes, as though seeing through the wooden panels into the silent room beyond. Her gaze grew distant for a moment, and I saw a quiet sadness settle across her face. I woke again early this morning just before dawn. I remember the clock beside my bed had not yet struck 5. That was when I heard footsteps in the back alley, heavy footsteps, moving slowly, pausing, and then moving again. She swallowed softly, her throat bobbing above the edge of her scarf. When I stood to look out my window, I saw the garden gate swinging open in the breeze. It is always locked at night, always. Mr. Maynard kept it locked, and so did old Mr. Jensen, who owns the building. Holmes nodded slowly as he listened, his expression calm, encouraging her to continue without a single word of interruption. The hallway around us felt colder than the sitting room, the damp air seeping through cracks along the window frames and carrying with it the faint sense of coal smoke, old plaster, and the distant promise of fresh bread baking in unseen kitchens down the street. The woman's eyes returned to Holmes with sudden urgency, glimmering beneath the shadow of her hat brim. "I did not see anyone in the alley, sir, only the footprints in the mud near the gate. I thought perhaps he had gone out early, though he rarely left before sunrise. But when I heard the constables come later this morning, I knew something was wrong." Her voice broke slightly then, cracking like thin ice underfoot, though she quickly cleared her throat and straightened her back with quiet dignity. She looked down at her basket for a moment before speaking again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was a gentle man, Mr. Maynard. He never troubled anyone, always so polite, even when he could not see who was greeting him." Her fingers loosened slightly around the handle, the tension leaving her shoulders as though the act of speaking had eased some hidden burden from her chest. Holmes inclined his head once more, his posture calm and respectful. He thanked her in his quiet, measured tone, assuring her that her observations would help greatly in their understanding of the night's events. She nodded silently, turning away with small, careful steps down the narrow hallway, her basket swinging softly against her coat as she disappeared into the cold shadows beyond. Holmes remained standing there for a moment, watching her leave, his eyes narrowed in focused contemplation. Then, with a quiet inhale, he turned back into the flat. As he walked past me, I saw in his eyes the calm intensity of a man who had just received another small piece of a puzzle that was beginning to form an image neither of us yet fully understood, but that he was already beginning to see within the silent darkness of his brilliant mind. Holmes stepped back into the dim flat, closing the door behind him with a gentle thud that resonated quietly against the silent walls. The room felt colder now, as if the departure of the elderly neighbor had allowed the November chill to seep deeper into its corners. The lamp on the narrow shelf flickered slightly in the draught, casting long, shifting shadows across Maynard's still form slumped by the piano. For a few moments Holmes stood in absolute silence, his tall frame relaxed yet alert. His gaze moved steadily across the room, taking in the forgotten teacup near the door, the damp footprints on the wooden floor leading from the window, and the small violin case leaning open against the piano's side. Then, with calm deliberation, he stepped forward and lowered himself beside the dead violinist. He reached out and took Maynard's lifeless hand in his gloved fingers. The gesture was precise and gentle, almost respectful, as if Holmes was greeting an old friend rather than examining the cold remains of a murder victim. I watched from where I stood near the window, feeling the quiet weight of the moment settle deep into my chest. Holmes lifted Maynard's hand slightly, tilting it towards the lamplight. The fingers were slender and long, their joints swollen slightly with age and constant use. But the tips remained strong and firm, capped with rough calloused pads. Under the soft glow of the lamp, I saw the faint sheen upon his fingertips, a thin, sticky residue of fresh rosin. Its scent rose faintly into the cold air, mingling with the sharper tang of dried blood and the old wooden musk of the piano's cracked casing. Holmes held the violinist's hand for a long moment, his gaze moving from fingertip to fingertip, examining each small ridge and stain as though reading silent words carved into his skin. His expression remained calm and composed, yet I could see the deep focus in the still lines of his face, the subtle tension in his jaw, as his thoughts wove themselves together in silence. He lowered Maynard's hand slowly back to his lap, placing it with quiet care beside the blood-stained razor. Then he sat back on his heels, resting his elbows lightly upon his knees as he looked up at the piano. His eyes moved over its keys, many of them chipped along their edges from decades of use. The thin rosine dust sparkled faintly under the lamplight where it had settled across the keyboard's length. Holmes spoke softly into the quiet room, his deep voice blending seamlessly with the distant patter of rain against the window glass. He was playing just before he died, Watson. His words were calm, carrying no alarm, only the quiet certainty of a man who had found another hidden note within the melody of the mystery. No man prepares to die in the middle of a melody. I felt the truth of his observation settle over me, like the heavy London fog outside. Maynard had not sat here in resignation or despair. He had been playing, continuing the one thing that remained his, even in blindness and solitude, when death arrived to silence his music forever. Holmes's gaze drifted from the piano back to Maynard's peaceful, sightless face. For a long moment he remained still, his breathing deep and slow, as if committing every detail of the scene to memory before rising. Then he stood, brushing a small trace of rosin dust from his trousers as he turned towards me. His eyes, gray and calm under the flickering lamp, carried a focused sadness. But beneath that sadness, I saw the growing light of understanding, a quiet certainty that this death was far more than the lonely tragedy it appeared to be. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the window with a steady rhythm that sounded almost like the soft roll of piano keys under a skilled hand. The scent of rosin lingered in the air, merging with the cold dampness drifting in from the narrow alley. The room seemed to settle deeper into silence as Holmes moved away from the body, each step carrying with it the unspoken promise that the music Maynard left unfinished would not remain silent forever. Holmes remained quiet on our journey back to Baker Street. The carriage rumbled steadily through the misty November streets, its wheels splashing through shallow puddles as gas lamps flickered in the early twilight. The interior smelled of damp wool and old leather. Holmes sat opposite me, leaning back against the seat with his eyes half closed and his long fingers drumming an absent rhythm against his knee. But his mind, I knew, was fully awake, already weaving connections within the silent, dark corridors of his thoughts. When we arrived home, Mrs. Hudson had prepared fresh tea and laid a simple supper of cold chicken, buttered bread, and pickled onions upon our small dining table. Holmes paid it no attention. He removed his coat and scarf with brisk efficiency and strode directly to the piano in the far corner of our sitting room. The violin case from Maynard's flat remained tucked under his arm. He set it down gently upon a side table and drew from his inner pocket the evidence envelope containing the stained sheet of music. I settled myself into my armchair by the hearth, the gentle warmth of the fire brushing against my chilled shins. Holmes stood before the piano in silence for a long moment, studying the notes upon the page with deep concentration. Outside, the city fell into night, its noises softening into a distant hum, broken only by the occasional rattle of carriage wheels or the thin echoing call of a newspaper boy announcing tomorrow's headlines before retreating into the fog. Holmes placed the page upon the piano's music stand. The lamp above him cast a golden glow across the worn ivory keys and highlighted the careful furrows in his brow. He sat down with fluid precision, adjusted the bench, and rested his long fingers upon the keys as if greeting an old confidant. Then he began to play, striking each note in the exact order it appeared upon Maynard's sheet. The melody that emerged was jarring and incomplete. Its structure faltered every few measures, like a sentence interrupted before the verb arrived. The backward D, the mirrored F, and other odd notations formed a tune that felt tense and unfinished, leaving the ear aching for resolution. Holmes's fingers paused upon the final dissonant chord, letting it hang heavy in the quiet room before lifting his hands away. He did not speak. Instead, he reached for his notebook and a sharp pencil from the small table by the lamp. He began to write quickly, mapping each altered note to a corresponding letter, his pencil moving in swift, clean strokes. The only sounds in the room were the low crackle of the fire, the quiet tapping of pencil against paper, and the faint ticking of the mantel clock measuring the silent passage of time. I watched him work, noting the subtle shift in his posture as focus deepened further into certainty. His shoulders squared, and his breathing slowed, each inhale deliberate, each exhale steady. His eyes flicked back and forth between the coded sheet and the letters taking shape upon the page. Slowly, a line emerged, each letter revealed with calm precision, until the meaning stood clearly in the dim lamplight. He set down his pencil and regarded the message for a moment, his gray eyes unmoving. Then, in a low voice that carried across the quiet room with a chilling steadiness, he read aloud what Maynard had hidden among the broken notes. Save K6, 26, or die. For a moment, the only sound that followed was the soft tap of rain against the windows and the faint hiss of the gas lamp burning above his head. Holmes remained seated at the piano, his long fingers resting lightly against the keys as he stared at the message he had uncovered. The name meant little to me in that silent moment, but I saw in his expression that it meant everything to him. Outside, the fog pressed heavier against the window panes, blurring the glow of distant street lamps into pale amber ghosts upon the glass. Inside, the warmth of the sitting room wrapped around us. Yet I felt a quiet chill settle beneath my skin. Whatever K626 was, it had driven a blind violinist to leave a hidden message in his final unfinished melody. And Holmes knew, as I did, that such a message would never be written in vain. Holmes closed his notebook gently and placed it upon the piano's top beside the flickering lamp. Then he folded his hands together in his lap and sat in silence, listening to something only he could hear, the echo of hidden truths carried within broken notes, waiting to be revealed by the only man in London capable of hearing their true meaning. Holmes remained seated at the piano for several minutes, his tall frame leaning slightly forward, eyes unfocused upon the dim patterns of the rug beneath his polished shoes. The coded phrase, "Save K626 or die," hovered in the room like a silent melody waiting for resolution. The only sounds were the gentle hiss of the gas lamp above us, the soft popping of embers in the hearth, and the faint rhythmic patter of rain against the window panes. Finally, Holmes exhaled quietly and turned towards me, his expression calm but edged with a subtle intensity that told me his mind was already running far ahead of spoken conversation. I sat forward in my armchair, the warmth from the fire glowing against my legs as I watched him process this hidden clue with quiet precision. "Watson," he said, his deep voice smooth and steady. "K626 refers to Mozart's Requiem in D minor." I frowned, feeling the edges of familiarity brush against my memory. Mozart's Requiem, his final work before death, claimed him in Vienna, leaving the composition incomplete until his pupil finished it from his scattered notes and sketches. I recalled stories of the piece's haunting lacrimosa, a movement so filled with beauty and grief, it seemed to carry the weight of final confession within each measure. "But what could a blind street violinist have to do with that?" I asked, my voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile threads of thought weaving through Holmes's mind. Holmes turned back to the coated sheet resting upon the piano, his gray eyes sharpened with a calm focus, reading each reversed note and mirrored staff marking once more, as if ensuring no hidden line remained undiscovered. Outside the sitting room window, the gas lamps burned softly in the fog. Their glow diffused into pale amber orbs against the dark London streets. "Perhaps," he murmured, "Arthur Maynard uncovered a secret that some people would kill to bury." His words carried no drama, only a steady, matter-of-fact cadence that made their meaning all the more chilling. He remained seated at the piano for a long moment, fingers resting upon the smooth wood, his breathing calm and controlled as he followed the invisible pathways forming within his mind. I watched him in silence, feeling a quiet unease settle within me. The mystery was deepening into something far beyond a lonely death in a damp Fleet Street flat. Now it reached back across centuries, towards Vienna's darkened churches and Mozart's final nights hunched over candlelit manuscripts. It reached into the shadowed alleys of London, where secret transactions might flow beneath the hum of daily life, unnoticed by all but those who sought power within hidden knowledge. Holmes rose from the piano with smooth precision, tucking the coated sheet back into its evidence envelope. He moved to his writing desk and opened a narrow, leather-bound catalog of classical works, its spine cracked from years of his careful reference. His long fingers turned the pages with deliberate patience until he found the entry for K626. He read silently for a time, his eyes scanning each line with a focus so deep that his entire posture seemed carved from quiet concentration. I remained seated by the fire, listening to the comforting sounds of Baker Street at night, the muffled footsteps of Mrs. Hudson in the kitchen below, the slow ticking of the mantel clock, the distant rattle of a passing hansom cab over wet stones. Yet beneath this familiar domestic calm, a subtle tension wound itself tighter around my chest, as if the city itself held its breath in anticipation of what Holmes would uncover next. Finally, he closed the catalog and set it aside, his movements quiet and unhurried. He turned to me with eyes that carried the glimmer of certainty within their calm gray depths. "Watson," he said softly, "there is much more hidden within this death than mere sorrow. We must be ready to go deeper than ever before." He moved to his coat and scarf draped neatly upon the wooden rack by the door. As he prepared for the cold November streets, I rose from my chair, feeling the quiet ache of my knees as the warmth of the fire fell away from my legs. I reached for my own coat and walking cane, the brass handle cool and smooth beneath my palm. Holmes paused before the sitting room door, glancing back at the coated sheet upon the piano and then at me. Outside, the rain fell with steady persistence, tapping against the windows in a rhythm that blended with the hidden melody now threading its way through our lives. With calm certainty, he stepped into the hallway, and I followed him out of the warm sitting room, knowing we were walking towards a mystery built not only from secrets and greed, but from the silent power of music itself, a power that, in death as in life, refused to be silenced. The following morning dawned gray and muted, as though the city itself was reluctant to stir from its uneasy dreams. A thin veil of fog clung low across Baker Street, softening the edges of passing carriages, and the gas lamps flickering dimly in the early light. Holmes stood by the window, tall and silent, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as he watched the slow emergence of day through the glass. The pale glow lit only part of his face, deepening the shadows around his eyes and sharpening the quiet determination within them. He turned away from the window with a fluid movement, his coat already draped across his shoulders, scarf tucked neatly beneath his collar. Without a word he gestured towards the door, and I rose from my armchair by the hearth, placing aside the newspaper I had barely read. The embers in the grate glowed faintly, casting their dying warmth into the quiet room as we stepped out into the chilled corridor. The carriage Holmes hailed carried us swiftly through the thickening morning fog, wheels rattling across the damp cobblestones. We sat in silence, the windows misting over with each exhale, blurring the shapes of passing buildings into shifting shadows. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the fog ahead, his mind following a trail only he could see. As for me, I felt a quiet anticipation building beneath my ribs, knowing we were heading into the realm he loved most, the quiet libraries, hidden manuscripts, and silent guardians of forgotten knowledge. When we arrived at the British Library, the great stone edifice loomed above us, its pillars wrapped in mist that drifted across the wide steps like restless spirits. Inside, the warmth and hush of the reading halls enveloped us instantly. The smell of paper, ink, and polished oak shelves settled deep into my chest, calming the faint ache of the cold outside. The long rows of catalogues stood like silent sentinels, each drawer a narrow gateway into centuries of accumulated human thought. Holmes moved with quiet purpose towards the rare music manuscripts division, his boots whispering across the marble floor. The librarian on duty, a thin man with stooped shoulders and spectacles perched delicately upon the bridge of his nose, looked up from his writing desk with a polite nod. Holmes greeted him softly, his voice carrying its familiar calm authority, and asked to see the records relating to Mozart's K626. The librarian's eyes flickered briefly with curiosity before he turned to the tall oak filing cabinet behind his desk. He withdrew a leather-bound ledger and laid it upon the polished wood, its heavy covers opening with a creak that echoed quietly through the vaulted chamber. The faint scent of old ink rose from its pages as he flipped through entry after entry, each lined with careful handwriting in black fountain pen, the dates stretching back more than a century. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning each line with precise focus. The hush of the library surrounded us, filled only with the occasional rustle of pages turned by distant scholars and the muffled footsteps of attendants moving between reading tables under high-arched windows. Rumors had long circulated among music historians, the librarian murmured in his thin, wavering voice, about a lost version of Mozart's Requiem. Extra movements, never published before his death, supposedly hidden within his pupils' private notes or held back by cautious archivists fearing scandal or sacrilege. His fingers paused upon a particular line, tapping it lightly to draw Holmes's attention. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he read. There it was, an entry detailing a restricted loan for the original K626 manuscript. The borrower's name was written in looping black script, followed by a neat address in South Kensington. The librarian adjusted his spectacles, glancing between Holmes and the entry, with a faint trace of apprehension in his lined face. "He has not returned it yet, sir," he said quietly, closing the ledger with deliberate care. "The loan was made several weeks ago. We are awaiting its return." Holmes inclined his head in calm gratitude, his gloved fingers tapping lightly upon the leather cover before turning away. As we stepped back into the broad marble hallway, I felt the warmth of the reading chamber fade behind us, replaced by the cool breath of the library's vast corridors. Holmes tucked his notebook away in his inner pocket and buttoned his coat with precise movements. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the city in a hushed, shifting darkness, even as daylight pressed feebly against it. We walked down the broad stone steps towards the waiting carriage, our footsteps echoing softly behind us. As Holmes climbed in beside me, his eyes were calm and distant, but I could feel the sharpened purpose within his silence. The name in that ledger, Julien de Moray, was now a note within the growing melody of this mystery, and I knew Holmes would follow its echo to wherever it led, no matter how silent or shadowed the path might become. The carriage rattled steadily through the narrow streets of London, cutting its path through fog so dense it blurred the outlines of street lamps into hazy golden orbs. The world outside felt muffled and indistinct, the wheels splashing quietly through shallow puddles left by the morning's lingering drizzle. Inside the carriage, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his eyes cast downward but unfocused, seeing not the damp wooden floor at his feet, but something far beyond it. An invisible path traced through hidden connections that only he could follow. At last, he spoke in his low, calm voice, so sudden in the quiet that it startled me from my own drifting thoughts. "Julien de Moray," he said, his eyes still distant. "The name carries weight within certain academic circles. He is known as a private collector, primarily of rare music manuscripts, but his reputation is complex." He paused, leaning back against the seat, his gloved hands folded lightly in his lap. Outside the carriage window, the fog parted momentarily, revealing rows of neat Georgian houses with black iron railings lining their stoops. The gas lamps flickered softly, casting gentle pools of amber light across the slick stone pavement. Moray's address in South Kensington brought us to a quiet residential street, lined with elegant townhouses, painted in shades of cream and dove gray. Tall, narrow windows glowed with the muted light of morning lamps behind thick lace curtains. The fog drifted lazily around the wrought iron gates, curling along garden hedges and vanishing into hidden pathways between the houses. Holmes stepped down from the carriage with quiet grace, his shoes landing upon the wet pavement without a splash. I followed, feeling the cold dampness of the fog settle upon my coat and hat, its chill slipping through to my skin. Holmes glanced up at the townhouse before us. It was tall and narrow, its stonework clean and meticulously maintained, with a dark wooden door polished to a mirror finish. The brass door knocker, shaped into the form of a laurel-crowned lyre, gleamed softly in the dim light. Holmes paused for a moment on the steps, his eyes tracing the edges of the windows, the faint flicker of a lamp behind a gauze curtain on the second floor, the small brass plaque mounted beside the doorbell. Its inscription was simple and elegant: Julien de Moray, private collector. He reached out and pressed the doorbell with a single precise movement. From within came the muffled echo of chimes, delicate and musical, fading into silence that felt thick with anticipation. We waited in stillness upon the front step, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves in the small front garden and the distant clatter of a milk cart rounding the corner at the end of the street. Footsteps approached from inside, measured and deliberate. The door opened to reveal a man of slight build, dressed impeccably in a dark charcoal morning suit, his white shirt fastened at the throat. with a thin black silk tie. His hair, long and black, was tied neatly at the nape of his neck with a narrow ribbon. His face was pale and narrow, his sharp cheekbones casting faint shadows in the soft gaslight that spilled from the hall behind him. For a moment he regarded us with quiet scrutiny, his dark eyes flicking between Holmes and myself. Then his expression shifted into a polite, controlled smile. "May I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice low, smooth, and unhurried, carrying with it the careful enunciation of a man used to speaking only when words were necessary. Holmes inclined his head slightly in greeting, his posture relaxed, yet commanding. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. We are here on behalf of an inquiry involving a Mr. Arthur Maynard." At the mention of Maynard's name, a subtle flicker crossed Moray's face. It was so swift that any untrained observer might have missed it. The slightest widening of his eyes, a faint tension at the corner of his thin mouth, before his polite smile returned, unchanged, in its quiet civility. "Of course," he replied smoothly, stepping back to allow us entry. "Please come in. I have only just finished arranging some acquisitions. I would be glad to assist your investigation in any way I can." We stepped into the hallway, the scent of aged paper and polished mahogany enveloping us instantly. The floors were covered in narrow Persian runners, their deep reds and navy blues muted by the dim light from a tall brass lamp near the stairwell. Along the walls hung framed sheets of music, each mounted with meticulous care behind glass, their titles handwritten in fading sepia ink. Italian sonatas, Austrian choral excerpts, and what appeared to be early drafts of Mozart's works. Moray closed the door behind us with quiet precision. As he moved past, I caught a glimpse of his wrist beneath his dark sleeve, thin, almost fragile, yet there was a tautness in his movements that spoke of control rather than weakness. He gestured towards a narrow corridor leading deeper into the townhouse. "Please," he said, his voice remaining calm and measured, "join me in the study. We will speak there. I have no doubt you will wish to see my collection as well." His words carried no trace of anxiety. Yet the fleeting shadow I had seen upon his face when Holmes spoke Maynard's name lingered in my mind, like the memory of an unexpected dissonant chord within an otherwise flawless melody. As we followed him down the silent corridor, lined with leather-bound catalogs and framed manuscripts, I felt the quiet certainty within me grow stronger. Whatever truth this man held, regarded with the same precision and deliberation as his priceless collection. And Holmes would soon begin the work of unlocking each hidden note within them. Moray led us through a narrow hallway, lined with tall oak shelves, each packed tightly with rows of manuscripts, catalogs, and framed certificates from music academies across Europe. The scent of aged paper grew stronger the deeper we walked, blending with the faint aroma of wood polish and the colder mineral smell of the stone flooring beneath the thick Persian runner. At the end of the hall, Moray paused before a heavy wooden door carved with intricate floral patterns. He turned the brass handle with quiet precision and gestured for us to enter. The study beyond was long and narrow, lined with shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling. Small glass display cabinets stood against the far wall, each housing rolled manuscripts tied neatly with ribbon and sealed in protective parchment covers. The dim light of two brass lamps cast a warm glow across the polished surfaces, creating deep shadows among the stacked folders and scattered music stands. Holmes stepped inside first, his eyes sweeping the room with calm precision. He moved slowly, his gaze absorbing every object, every shadow, every speck of dust along the carved cornices near the ceiling. Moray followed us in, closing the door gently behind him before stepping past to a small desk positioned by the window at the room's end. The curtains were drawn half shut, allowing a thin blade of pale daylight to cut across his desk, illuminating the stacks of papers arranged there with mathematical neatness. Holmes's eyes paused upon the neat piles. He stood silently in the center of the room, his tall frame relaxed, yet radiating a quiet intensity. Moray sat down behind his desk, folding his thin hands together upon a closed leather-bound folder. For a few moments, there was no sound beyond the ticking of a small brass clock upon the mantel, its rhythm steady and faint beneath the weight of the silence. Holmes spoke softly, his voice smooth and even. "You knew Arthur Maynard, I believe." Moray's gaze flickered up to meet his, and again I saw that brief shadow cross his face before his expression returned to its polished calm. "Yes," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "Mr. Maynard was employed by me on occasion. He was skilled with transcription. Even blind, his ear for music notation was exceptional. I found his services useful in my work, cataloging rare pieces for private documentation." Holmes remained silent, his gray eyes fixed upon Moray with calm attentiveness. The collector shifted slightly in his chair, lifting a thin stack of papers from his desk and aligning their edges with deliberate care. I watched his fingers as they moved. They were long and pale, the nails neatly trimmed, though a faint yellowing near the tips suggested tobacco or chemicals, something not typically associated with a man whose life was spent among paper and ink. As Moray adjusted his papers, Holmes's gaze flicked to a small polished box on the edge of the desk. Its lid was open just enough to reveal a glimpse of its contents: several watch parts, tiny gears and pins arranged upon a square of velvet. Beside it lay a gold pocket watch, its casing engraved with ornate scrolling. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly as he noted a faint smudge of brown upon its rim, like dried mud or clay. The collector's thumb brushed against it unconsciously as he continued speaking. "Maynard's death is tragic," Moray said softly, though his eyes did not reflect sadness. They remained calm, detached, as though he was reciting an inventory list rather than acknowledging a man's violent end. He was reliable, and his rates were agreeable. It is difficult to find such skill among London's amateur musicians these days. Most lack discipline. Holmes said nothing. He stepped slowly towards the glass cabinets lining the far wall, his shoes making no sound against the thick rug. He paused before a tall display containing a rolled parchment bound with deep burgundy ribbon. The wax seal bore an emblem I did not recognize, an elaborate crest with two crossed violin bows beneath a stylized crown. Moray's eyes flickered towards Holmes with sudden alertness, though his voice remained perfectly smooth when he spoke again. "Those are restricted pieces, Mr. Holmes. Unfinished manuscripts and private notations never meant for public performance. Their value lies in their rarity, not their musicality." Holmes turned towards him, his expression remaining calm, almost indifferent, though I saw the quiet gleam in his eyes. For a moment, silence fell again across the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the muffled hum of the city beyond the curtained window. Then Holmes inclined his head with polite precision and stepped away from the cabinet. He moved back to the center of the room, folding his gloved hands lightly behind his back. "Thank you, Mr. Moray," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your cooperation has been most illuminating." Moray inclined his head in return, though his dark eyes watched Holmes with a still wariness. As we turned to leave, Holmes's gaze flicked one last time towards the pocket watch upon the desk. The smudge of dried mud upon its rim seemed almost to pulse in the dim lamplight, silent testimony to secrets yet unspoken. As we stepped back into the quiet hallway, the air felt colder, as though the warmth of the study had been nothing but an illusion. Holmes walked ahead of me in silence, his posture relaxed, but I could sense the focused urgency gathering within him. Whatever lay hidden within Julien de Marais' careful world of manuscripts and secret acquisitions was beginning to reveal itself, note by note, in a melody only Holmes could hear. We stepped back out into the dense November fog that rolled along the street like silent river mist, wrapping around the black iron railings and softening the yellow glow of gas lamps into trembling halos. The cold, damp air settled upon my coat and hat, seeping through to my skin with a chill that felt almost cleansing after the heavy, dusty warmth of Moray's study. Holmes paused for a moment on the narrow stone steps of the townhouse, his gaze lifting to scan the upper windows where faint flickers of light glowed behind drawn curtains. His expression remained calm, composed, but I saw the subtle narrowing of his eyes and the slight tightening of his gloved hands at his sides. Each small movement told me he was processing every detail he had seen within that room, cataloging them quietly into his vast mental vault where nothing was ever misplaced or forgotten. Without a word, he turned and stepped lightly down to the pavement. I followed him to the waiting carriage, the driver sitting hunched under his heavy oilskin coat, reins slack in his mittened hands as the horses pawed at the damp cobblestones, steam rising faintly from their flanks. Holmes spoke softly to him, his voice blending with the muffled sounds of distant carriages and the occasional sharp echo of boot heels against stone. We returned to Baker Street in silence, each lost in thought. The carriage rattled over uneven paving stones, its narrow interior filling with the familiar smells of damp wool, polished leather seats, and faint traces of coal smoke drifting in through the small ventilation hatch. Holmes sat leaning forward, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon the dark blur of passing buildings beyond the rain-speckled glass. I watched him, noting the stillness in his posture, a stillness that spoke of fierce, focused thought rather than calm repose. Back in our sitting room, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a pot of fresh tea and a plate of warm currant scones. Holmes acknowledged her with a quiet nod but did not touch the food. He removed his coat and scarf with swift, efficient movements, hung them upon the rack, and immediately crossed to his writing desk. The faint scent of damp wool lingered in the air behind him, mingling with the warm fragrance of baking that drifted up from the kitchen below. He removed his notebook from his inner pocket and flipped it open, placing it neatly upon the blotter before him. His pencil moved swiftly, the tip scratching faintly across the thick cream pages as he wrote down a list of observations. I watched the words form in his quick, precise script. Pocket watch, gold, ornate, mud-smudge rim, watch parts, desk box, active repair, fingers stained faintly yellow, possible chemical exposure, backroom glass cabinet, sealed manuscripts, Viana crest, Moray reaction to Maynard name, flicker of fear beneath control. Holmes paused for a moment, tapping the pencil lightly against the page. Then he set it down and closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair with a quiet exhale. The lamplight glowed softly across his angular features, casting calm shadows upon his cheekbones and brow. After several minutes, he opened his eyes and turned towards me. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, carrying a calm certainty that settled over the room like a warm blanket. Tomorrow, Watson, we return to South Kensington. But this time, we will knock upon his door not as polite visitors, but as men who come seeking the truth. I nodded silently, feeling the quiet resolve in his words wrap around my chest with an almost physical weight. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, blurring the faint flicker of gas lamps along Baker Street into pale, watchful stars. Holmes closed his notebook and set it upon the desk. Then he rose and moved to the window, standing tall and still as he looked out into the dark, silent street below. I watched him, feeling the deep hush of the room settle around us, broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the soft pop of settling embers within the grate. In that moment I knew that tomorrow's polite knock upon Julien de Moret's polished door would be only the beginning. Behind that carefully guarded entrance lay a hidden chamber of secrets Holmes was determined to unearth, secrets that, like an unfinished melody, could never remain silent forever. The following morning arrived draped in a pale, colorless dawn. Fog pressed tightly against the windows of Baker Street, dimming the early light into a thin silver glow that barely reached the floorboards. Holmes stood by the hearth, long and silent, one hand resting lightly upon the mantelpiece as he stared into the smoldering embers within. His dressing gown hung loose around his tall frame, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco clung to his hair and collar. He did not speak until the clock on the mantel struck 7, its soft chime echoing through the quiet sitting room. Then, with fluid precision, he turned away from the hearth and moved toward his writing desk, where the coded sheet from Maynard's flat lay unfolded beside his closed notebook. His movements were unhurried, every action deliberate and quiet, as though he wished not to disturb the heavy hush that clung to the dawn. By 8, he was dressed in his dark wool suit, coat buttoned neatly to the throat, scarf wrapped and pinned with simple efficiency. We left Baker Street without breakfast, the cold morning air biting at our cheeks as we stepped into the silent, fog-bound street. Our carriage arrived swiftly and carried us through South Kensington's quiet lanes, wheels whispering over damp cobblestones slick with the dew. Moret's townhouse appeared ahead, its cream-stone facade emerging like a ghost from the fog. The black iron railings glistened with beads of moisture. Holmes stepped down from the carriage before it had fully halted, his polished shoes landing upon the pavement with quiet finality. He walked to the door with measured calm, each step echoing faintly beneath the overhanging portico. I followed, feeling the cold settle deep into my coat sleeves and gloves. He knocked softly upon the dark wooden door, the laurel-crowned lyre knocker thudding against its brass plate with polite restraint. Within moments, Moret himself appeared, dressed once more in his immaculate charcoal suit. His dark hair was tied back neatly, and his pale, thin face bore its usual polite composure, though his eyes flickered with fleeting uncertainty as they moved between Holmes and myself. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice low and carefully controlled. "You returned early this morning. May I assume you have further questions about Mr. Maynard?" Holmes inclined his head slightly in greeting, stepping past Moret's extended hand as he entered the hall with calm assurance. The air inside was warm, scented faintly of beeswax polish and old paper. I noticed that Moret did not close the door immediately, as though considering whether to allow us entry. But Holmes was already halfway down the corridor, his tall frame moving towards the study with silent confidence. Inside the study, the lamps had been lit, despite the pale dawn beyond the curtains. Their golden glow revealed stacks of manuscripts arranged neatly upon the polished desk and tall glass cabinets lining the far wall. Moret followed us in, clasping his thin hands lightly before him. Holmes turned towards him with quiet focus, his gray eyes calm yet watchful. "We are grateful for your time, Mr. Moret," Holmes said in his smooth, even tone. "Might I trouble you to show me once again your pocket watch?" For a moment, silence fell across the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the brass clock upon the mantel. Moray's thin lips parted in silent surprise, though his composure did not fully slip. He blinked once before nodding, reaching into the inner breast pocket of his jacket with measured care. He withdrew the gold watch and held it out upon his open palm. Holmes stepped forward slowly, his gloved hand reaching to lift the watch. He turned it over with delicate precision, the engraved casing catching the lamplight in intricate curls of gold. Along the edge of the casing, near the winding crown, remained the faint smudge of dried mud or clay that Holmes had noticed the previous day. Under the clear lamplight it appeared brownish gray, tinged with a fine grit that clung to the ridged edges of the engraving. Holmes tilted the watch closer to his eyes, his face calm and unreadable. His thumb brushed lightly across the smudge, lifting a single tiny fragment free. He regarded it for a moment before flicking it away into the small brass tray upon Moray's desk. "You keep your watch in good repair," Holmes observed quietly, his tone free of accusation. "The inner workings appear clean. You maintain them yourself?" Moray inclined his head once, his voice remaining smooth and even. "I do. My father was a horologist. He taught me how to clean and repair small mechanisms. I find it calming." Holmes nodded slowly, his gray eyes never leaving Moray's pale, composed face. "Indeed," he murmured, "a steady hand and focused mind are essential in such work." He turned the watch over once more before returning it to Moray's open palm. Moray closed his thin fingers around it with silent precision, slipping it back into his pocket. For a moment the room felt heavy with unsaid words. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder in the hush, punctuated by the faint rustle of the curtains as a chill breeze slipped in through a cracked window frame. Holmes stepped back, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. "Thank you, Mr. Moray. That will be all for today. You have been most gracious with your time." Moray inclined his head again, the controlled politeness in his eyes returning, though I saw a flicker of something deeper within them, unease, or perhaps a hidden anger, carefully leashed. Holmes turned away, and I followed him out of the study into the quiet hall. As Moray closed the front door behind us, the fog wrapped instantly around our shoulders, cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and distant chimney smoke. Holmes paused upon the steps, glancing back at the polished brass knocker, now blurred in the fog, the footprints below Maynard's window. "Watson," he said softly, his voice blending with the hush of the street. They were not merely those of a passerby. They were made by a man who carries clay under his nails and mud upon his cuffs, a man who repairs his own watch and stands silently in the dark. He turned and stepped lightly down to the pavement, his coat swirling softly around his ankles as he walked towards the waiting carriage. I followed, feeling a quiet tension settle deeper within me, knowing that each careful observation Holmes had made was another note in a hidden melody only he could hear, a melody that was leading us closer to a truth still cloaked in shadows. Back in Baker Street, the fog had lifted slightly by midday, revealing the city's familiar gray skyline under a muted winter sun. Holmes sat at his writing desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon an invisible point beyond the window. The coded sheet lay open before him, alongside his notebook filled with neat lines of observations. The fire burned quietly in the grate, its gentle warmth curling into the room and mingling with the faint scent of tea that Mrs. Hudson had left untouched upon the side table. After a long silence, Holmes spoke in his calm, low voice. "Moray's watch carried dried clay, Watson, not common garden soil. Clay mixed with fine grit, typical of Fleet Street's old drainage paths. He visited Maynard in the final hours. I nodded, watching him from my armchair by the hearth. Holmes's eyes remained distant but alert, as though following silent figures moving within his mind. We returned to Moray's townhouse later that afternoon, Holmes determined to confront him before shadows fell again over South Kensington. The same maid admitted us, her eyes downcast, as she led us down the dim corridor towards the study. The lamps glowed faintly against the polished wood-paneled walls, and the same scent of aged paper, beeswax polish, and faint tobacco smoke drifted through the silent house. Moray was seated at his desk, long fingers moving with quiet precision as he arranged pages into neat leather folders embossed with gold titles in French and Italian. He looked up as we entered, his dark eyes flicking first to Holmes, then to me, before returning to his careful work. Holmes stood in the center of the study, posture relaxed, yet commanding. For a moment he remained silent, watching Moray with calm focus, as the collector continued stacking pages without pause. Finally Holmes spoke, his voice smooth and low, carrying the quiet gravity of certainty. "Mr. Moray, I must ask you directly, what was your true relationship with Arthur Maynard?" Moray's fingers paused, the faintest tremor passing through his right hand, before he set the folder down. He leaned back in his leather chair and regarded Holmes with composed stillness, though a shadow passed behind his eyes, darkening their calm veneer. "Maynard worked for me," he said softly, his tone controlled yet threaded with an edge of weary resignation. He transcribed music by ear. "I employed him for small commissions, simple work, yet he was diligent. Blindness sharpened his musical memory, a useful trait in my activities." Holmes tilted his head slightly, watching him in silence. The ticking of the small brass clock upon the mantel filled the pause, each measured beat echoing through the quiet room. Moray sighed, a thin, almost bitter sound that fluttered out between his pale lips. "He threatened me, Mr. Holmes." He discovered what he was truly copying. He realized the manuscript he worked upon was not a simple Baroque exercise. It was the lost version of Mozart's Requiem, K626, with extended movements, a version no scholar has seen in centuries. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where dusk gathered against the gauze curtains, deepening the faint glow of the lamps into quiet golden halos. When he understood its value, he demanded more money, Moray continued, his voice tightening with quiet anger. He threatened to take it to the newspapers, to professors, to collectors who would pay him beyond anything I could offer. He believed he held power, and perhaps he did for a fleeting moment. Holmes remained silent. His eyes were fixed upon Moray with calm attentiveness, revealing nothing of his thoughts. Moray turned back towards his desk, thin fingers tracing the engraved brass corners of the closed folder before him. "I warned him," Moray whispered, almost to himself. "I told him there were people who would not hesitate to silence him for such knowledge, but he did not listen. He thought blindness protected him from shadows. It did not." His voice fell silent then, the words fading into the hushed room like the final echo of a low piano chord. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint shifting of embers settling in the small iron grate and the distant rumble of a carriage passing along the fog-draped street outside. Holmes finally spoke, his tone calm and even. "And did you deliver that silence yourself, Mr. Moray?" Moray's dark eyes flickered back to Holmes's, and for the first time since we had met him, I saw true fear flicker across his narrow face, breaking the polished calm of his mask for a brief, unguarded heartbeat. Then he looked away, staring down at his folded hands, and said nothing more. Holmes turned and walked quietly towards the door. his footsteps muffled against the thick Persian rug. I followed him out of the study and into the dim hallway. As the maid closed the front door softly behind us, the fog rose again from the street, curling around our shoulders with cold, damp fingers. We stood there in silence, the quiet of South Kensington pressing close around us. Holmes breathed deeply, his chest lifting under his dark coat. His eyes narrowed against the growing darkness of evening. "Maynard's death was not an accident, Watson," he said softly, his voice carrying a steady certainty that cut through the muffled hush of the fog-bound street. "And Moray fears something far greater than the hangman's noose. He fears the shadows within which he moves." He turned and stepped down to the pavement, his stride long and deliberate, as he walked towards the waiting carriage. I followed him, feeling the deepening quiet of the approaching night settle around my heart like a silent, unplayed melody, its final note still hidden somewhere far beyond the gathering dark. We rode back to Baker Street in near total silence. The carriage rattled over damp paving stones, its lantern casting a dim circle of flickering light that danced across fog-wrapped railings and brick walls. The city was sliding into evening, and with it came a deeper hush, as though London itself was bracing against secrets it preferred not to know. Holmes sat opposite me, his long legs crossed neatly beneath his coat. He rested his chin lightly upon his gloved knuckles, staring past my shoulder at the shadowed interior of the carriage. The faint glow of the lamp above us revealed the distant focus in his eyes, a gaze fixed upon thoughts far removed from the bouncing motion of our journey. Finally I spoke, unable to remain silent amid the tension that pulsed between us. He sounded more worried about losing his precious manuscript than about a man's life, I said softly, the words half swallowed by the muffled clatter of hooves upon wet stone. Holmes did not respond at first. The carriage turned sharply onto Baker Street, the driver urging the horses forward through the thickening fog. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and calm, carrying no emotion, but edged with an undercurrent of sharpened thought. "Moray lives for possession, Watson. For men like him, the manuscript is not simply paper and ink. It is a key to status, control, and quiet power among his hidden circles. A life is an inconvenience by comparison." I watched him as he spoke, noting how his eyes remained unfocused, blinking only once every few seconds as he followed the silent unfolding of his deductions. Outside, the gas lamps flickered faintly, their golden halos blurred into the fog, illuminating lone figures wrapped in coats and scarves as they hurried along the pavements, boots tapping quietly in the gathering dark. The carriage slowed to a halt before our familiar stoop. Holmes stepped down first, his polished shoes landing upon the damp stone with their usual soft finality. I followed, feeling the cold evening air bite into my cheeks as I pulled my scarf tighter around my throat. Inside, Baker Street was warm with the scent of oak smoke drifting from the hearth and faint traces of Mrs. Hudson's fresh bread cooling upon the kitchen table. Holmes removed his coat and scarf with quiet efficiency and crossed directly to his writing desk, ignoring the small stack of correspondence that Mrs. Hudson had left upon the side table beside the lamp. He sat down, resting his long fingers lightly upon the closed notebook before him. The coded sheet from Maynard's flat still lay there, its stained margins curling slightly in the warmth of the room. For a long time, Holmes did not move or speak. The lamplight cast steady illumination across his sharp features, deepening the shadows around his eyes and cheekbones. His breathing remained calm and quiet, each exhale controlled, as though he was centering his mind before his next move. Finally, he opened his notebook and wrote a single line in his quick, precise script. "Moray fears more than exposure. He fears retribution." He closed the notebook gently and sat back in his chair, folding his hands together upon his lap. His gaze drifted to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass, glowing faintly in the lamplight like pale smoke. I remained silent, knowing he needed no questions from me just yet. Outside, the city continued its quiet surrender to night. The distant toll of church bells marked the hour, their soft, mournful tones echoing across rooftops and chimneys, fading into the fog-bound darkness. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment and drew a slow, deep breath. When he opened them again, they were sharp with focus, and though his face remained calm, I saw in his expression the quiet certainty that the darkness of this mystery was only just beginning to reveal its truest depths. The following morning arrived with a gray sky streaked by drifting clouds, the sun hidden behind London's dense winter haze. The streets outside Baker Street were already alive with the subdued clatter of delivery carts and the muffled calls of milkmen making their rounds. Holmes stood by the window, silent and composed, dressed in his dark wool suit, coat folded neatly over his arm, as he gazed out into the quiet commotion below. At 8:30, he turned towards me, his expression calm yet edged with that precise focus I had come to recognize as the harbinger of decisive action. "Today, Watson," he said in his low, even voice, "we confirm what Moray keeps hidden." An hour later, we stood once more upon the narrow stone steps of Moray's South Kensington townhouse. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the cream facade of the building in muted daylight. Holmes knocked upon the door with a firm, polite rap, then stepped back, eyes flicking across the polished brass plaque beside the entrance. The maid answered swiftly, her expression composed, though her eyes flickered with mild apprehension as she recognized us. "Mr. Moray is away at a private auction until mid-afternoon," she informed us, her voice quiet and careful. Holmes nodded, his posture relaxed. "I will not trouble him today. I have been sent by the London Piano Tuners Guild to confirm an appointment he arranged earlier this month. His Bosendorfer in the study, I believe." The maid hesitated, glancing back down the corridor before stepping aside, allowing Holmes to enter, with me close behind. The hall smelled faintly of floor polish and old mahogany, warm and dry against the damp air outside. She gestured towards the study and left us there, closing the door softly behind her. Holmes's eyes scanned the room with silent precision. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing strips of pale daylight to illuminate the neat stacks of manuscripts upon Moray's polished desk. The glass cabinets along the far wall gleamed dully in the dim light, their shelves filled with rolled parchments and thin leather folders bound with ribbon. Holmes moved past the piano without pause, his tall frame silent as he crossed to the far end of the room. He paused before the large walnut bookcase built into the rear wall. Its shelves rose nearly to the ceiling, lined with volumes in dark bindings, stamped with faded gold lettering. Holmes removed his gloves and slipped them into his coat pocket before running his fingertips lightly along the vertical edges of the shelves. His touch was gentle and unhurried, moving from joint to joint until he paused at a narrow seam where the bookshelf met the paneling. He pressed his fingers carefully along the seam. A faint click sounded from deep within the wood. Holmes tilted his head, his expression remaining calm, his gray eyes narrowing slightly with quiet certainty. He pressed again, and with a subtle creak, the entire section of shelving shifted outward by an inch, revealing a narrow-shadowed crack between it and the paneled wall behind. With a single smooth motion, Holmes slid the shelf open on hidden hinges, revealing a small vault built into the stone behind. Its iron door was half open, and the scent that drifted out was cool and dry, laced with the faintest notes of old paper, binding glue, and the metallic tang of archival storage. He leaned forward, his tall frame folding smoothly as he peered inside. The vault was narrow but deep, lined with thin oak shelves upon which sat folders stamped with neat Latin titles, their edges trimmed in red leather. Thin slips of parchment protruded like silent bookmarks from between the pages, marked with precise Roman numerals in dark ink. Along the bottom shelf, stacked horizontally, lay several music manuscripts bound in faded leather and stamped with seals Holmes recognized instantly. He reached out and lifted one of them carefully into the filtered daylight. The cover bore an Austrian seal embossed in tarnished gold leaf, its curling design partially rubbed away by time and handling. Holmes traced the letters beneath it with his thumb, reading them in a quiet voice that blended with the soft ticking of Morey's brass desk clock. Requiem K626, original version, Dies Irae, extended Lacrimosa. His eyes remained steady upon the worn letters, his face composed, though I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw and the quiet rise of his chest as he drew in a slow, deliberate breath. Gently, he turned the manuscript towards me. Even in the dim light of the study, I could see the pages were thick and yellowed with age, each bar line drawn by hand with absolute precision. The ink had faded to a deep sepia, but the meticulous notation remained perfectly legible, a silent music that carried the weight of centuries within its quiet markings. Holmes placed the manuscript back upon its shelf with reverent care. He remained kneeling before the open vault, his eyes scanning its contents with focused intensity. Each folder, each sealed envelope, each hidden volume was a silent note in the melody he had been following since Maynard's death. Then his gaze shifted to a small wooden box tucked behind the last row of folders. Its lid was carved with two crossed violin bows beneath a stylized mask of porcelain white. Holmes reached for it with calm deliberation, his fingers curling around its edges as he lifted it into the light. He did not open it yet. Instead, he sat back on his heels, his tall frame folding into stillness as he regarded the box, the manuscript shelves, and the silent vault itself. "Behind this hidden door, Watson," Holmes murmured softly, his voice edged with quiet finality, "Morey keeps more than music. He keeps secrets powerful enough to demand silence, silence purchased with a blind man's life." He closed the vault door with a gentle push, the iron panel sliding back into the stone with a faint metallic sigh. Standing, he turned towards me, his gray eyes calm, yet alight with silent certainty. "The melody is no longer unfinished, Watson. It is only beginning to reveal its final fatal notes." Outside, the muffled calls of street sellers drifted up from South Kensington's fog-bound pavements, mingling with the quiet ticking of the clock upon Morey's polished desk as Holmes stepped away from the hidden vault, already moving towards the deeper truths waiting beyond its silent threshold. Holmes remained standing before the hidden vault for a long moment, his tall frame still, his eyes fixed upon the narrow shelves lined with faded manuscripts. The dim light filtering through the half-drawn curtains illuminated his angular features, casting sharp shadows across his cheekbones and brow. I watched him from beside the piano, feeling the quiet tension radiating from his focused silence. Slowly, he reached back into the vault and withdrew the manuscript he had read only moments before. His gloved fingers moved with precise care, lifting the thick, time-darkened pages into the pale daylight. The leather binding creaked softly as he turned it, revealing the handwritten title upon its opening folio. Requiem K626, original version, Dies Irae, extended Lacrimosa. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of emotion passing across his composed expression. He lowered himself into a kneeling position before the open vault, resting the manuscript gently upon his knee as he turned each page with deliberate patience. The scent of aged parchment and dried ink drifted into the cool air around us, mingling with the subtle smell of wood polish and faint beeswax that clung to Moray's study. He paused upon the first page of the Lacrimosa. Its familiar notes were there, each line drawn with elegant, unbroken clarity, but below the final measures lay a new sequence extending far beyond the traditional ending. The handwriting was unmistakable, dense, precise, sloping slightly to the right, Mozart's own. Each note seemed to pulse with silent urgency, a message written across centuries that now revealed itself beneath Holmes's quiet gaze. He exhaled softly, the breath lifting a loose lock of hair that had fallen across his brow. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calm, merging with the quiet of the room. "It is real, Watson." Maynard was not mistaken. This is the missing extension scholars have searched for across 2 centuries. It was never a rumor. It was merely hidden. I stepped closer, leaning forward to see the music for myself. The final measures of the Lacrimosa stretched into a minor coda, unlike anything I had seen in Mozart's choral works. The notation was intricate yet powerful, suggesting a resolution darker and more complex than the traditional ending that generations had performed. Even in silence, I could sense its haunting gravity, the unfinished confession of a man writing from the edges of his own mortality. Holmes turned another page, revealing annotations in faded brown ink, German phrases, Latin quotations, and what appeared to be ciphered initials along the margins. His eyes moved rapidly across each note and marking, cataloging them with calm precision. Outside, the muffled noise of South Kensington drifted faintly through the curtains, the distant clatter of carriage wheels, the low hum of voices passing along the pavements, the echoing call of a costermonger advertising winter pears. Then Holmes closed the manuscript gently and slid it back onto the shelf, ensuring its spine aligned perfectly with the others beside it. He reached once more into the vault, retrieving a thin stack of letters bound together with a black silk ribbon. Their edges were frayed, and the wax seals that had once marked them closed were cracked and brittle with age. He untied the ribbon slowly, revealing the first letter within. It was written in an elaborate 18th century German script, the parchment darkened at its corners and curling slightly at the edges. Holmes read it silently, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity as he absorbed each word. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the calm finality of a man confirming what he had already deduced. "This confirms it, Watson. This manuscript was hidden by a secret circle within the Viennese court, a society sworn to protect forbidden works. Maynard must have uncovered a reference to it within the pages he was transcribing. That knowledge alone would have signed his death warrant." He returned the letters to their ribbon and replaced them within the vault. Then he closed the iron door, the faint metallic thud echoing quietly through the silent study. For a long moment, Holmes remained kneeling before the sealed vault, his head bowed slightly, his breathing calm and measured. When he rose, his movements were smooth and unhurried. He brushed a trace of dust from his trouser knee before turning towards me, his gray eyes steady and clear. Outside, the low rumble of distant thunder rolled through the city, vibrating faintly against the window glass and the polished shelves around us. "This is no longer a question of a single death, Watson," he said softly. "It is the uncovering of a secret hidden for centuries, a secret guarded by those willing to kill to keep its silence unbroken." He stepped away from the hidden vault, each footfall quiet upon the thick Persian rug. I followed him through the silent study, feeling the weight of what we had discovered settle deeply within my chest, like the final chord of an unfinished requiem, its echoes fading into shadows that still held secrets we had yet to reveal. Holmes stood before the closed vault in Moray's study, silent and still, his gray eyes fixed upon the wooden panels that now concealed centuries of secrets once more. The ticking of the small brass clock upon the mantel filled the quiet room, its steady rhythm merging with the muted hum of the city drifting through the curtained window. He turned away with calm precision, replacing his gloves upon his hands before picking up the small wooden box he had withdrawn earlier. Its carved lid, etched with two crossed violin bows beneath a porcelain mask, seemed to glow faintly in the dim lamplight. Holmes held it for a long moment, his fingers brushing lightly across the stylized emblem, as though reading an inscription written in silent script. He opened the box slowly. Inside lay several folded letters sealed with thick red wax, each marked with the same crossed violin and mask emblem impressed deeply into its surface. Alongside them sat a small ivory card embossed with gold script in German. Holmes lifted it from the box and read its words aloud in a quiet, even voice that seemed to blend seamlessly with the hush of the study. Die Vienna Ordnung, the Vienna Order. He paused, his brow furrowing slightly as his eyes scanned the short message beneath the emblem. Then he set the card down and replaced the letters within the box before closing its carved lid with a soft, final click. I stepped closer, feeling a subtle chill trace along my spine despite the warm air of the room. "The Vienna Order?" I asked softly, my voice careful not to disturb the fragile hush that surrounded us. Holmes's gaze lifted to meet mine, calm and steady, though his eyes burned with quiet focus. "It is an old society, Watson, founded by exiled musicians and composers at the end of the 18th century. They sought to protect works that were banned by the imperial court, music believed to contain harmonies too unsettling for public performance." He moved to Moray's broad desk, placing the box upon its polished surface before resting his hands lightly upon its edge. His tall frame leaned forward slightly as he spoke, the lamplight illuminating the fine lines of focus across his brow. "Their records speak of forbidden compositions, masses containing altered liturgical chants, sonatas laced with harmonic sequences said to induce visions, and requiems composed with cadences described in old occult treatises. Such music was hidden or destroyed by royal decree. Yet this order preserved it in silence, hidden among collections scattered across Europe. Outside the curtained window, a cold breeze rose along the street, rattling a loose shutter against its frame and carrying the distant call of a newspaper boy echoing along the fog-bound pavement. Holmes's voice remained low and calm, merging with the muted noises of London beyond the walls. Maynard found a reference to this hidden manuscript within the pages he transcribed. The Vienna Order would not risk such knowledge becoming public. To them, its exposure is not merely scandalous, it is dangerous. He paused, his gaze dropping to the small ivory card upon the desk. For a moment, silence returned to the room, heavy and watchful, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock, measuring the quiet seconds that passed between us. Then Holmes turned sharply, moving back to the closed vault. He ran his gloved fingertips along the carved edge of the hidden door, as though feeling the silent echo of centuries locked within the stone behind it. When he spoke again, his voice was low and certain. "Moray was not acting alone, Watson. He is merely their London custodian. This death, this threat, this hidden music, they are all tied to the Vienna Order's deeper purpose. and if they believe their silence threatened, they will kill again to preserve it. He stepped away from the vault, his posture tall and composed, his gray eyes alight with a quiet intensity that glimmered like steel in the dim lamplight. "We must return to Baker Street," he said softly. "There's more to learn before darkness falls tonight." As we left the study, the warm hush of the room settled back into silence behind us. The maid appeared at the corridor's end, her eyes wide with uncertainty as she watched Holmes walk past her without pause. I followed, feeling the cold edge of winter brush against my cheeks as we stepped once more into the pale afternoon fog, carrying with us the first true knowledge of a secret that had waited more than 200 years for the ears of a man who could hear its silent, hidden song. We rode back to Baker Street through streets still thick with lingering afternoon fog. The carriage wheels splashed quietly through shallow puddles, sending ripples across the stone gutters lined with fallen leaves turned black with damp. Holmes sat opposite me, his tall frame leaning back against the seat, eyes closed, his face composed and calm as though resting. Yet I knew his mind was turning silently through every detail we had uncovered, arranging them into their precise order until their meaning formed clear and undeniable. Inside Baker Street, the lamps were already lit, casting warm amber pools of light across the familiar rugs and shelves lined with chemical bottles, glass retorts, and stacked newspapers. Mrs. Hudson had left a fresh pot of tea upon the dining table, beside a loaf of buttered currant bread, its sweet scent filling the quiet room. Holmes removed his coat and scarf with smooth efficiency and crossed to his writing desk, retrieving his notebook with deliberate calm. He sat, opened it to a fresh page, and began to write, his pencil moving quickly across the thick paper in neat, precise lines. Viana order, hidden network. Maynard, transcriber. Threat, Moray custodian, silent fear. K626, lost Lacrimosa extension, forbidden motifs. Motive, secrecy above all. He paused, setting down the pencil before lifting his gaze to the coated sheet pinned upon the wall above his desk. The flickering lamplight cast his shadow, large and silent behind him, its stillness matching his own. Finally he spoke in a quiet voice, edged with certainty. "Maynard heard something he should never have heard, Watson. He found a reference to the extended Lacrimosa, or perhaps read a notation hidden within the manuscript that spoke of its true origin and preservation. The Viana order would have given Moray only one command: ensure his silence permanently before he sold copies to rival collectors, or worse, revealed their existence to the public. I sat in my armchair by the hearth, feeling the low warmth of the fire brush against my legs as his words settled heavily upon my chest. Outside, the fog drifted past the window in thickening waves, glowing faintly in the lamplight that spilled onto the street beyond the glass. For a long moment neither of us spoke, the quiet filled only by the slow ticking of the mantel clock and the distant muffled clip of hooves upon damp stone as carriages passed along Baker Street. Holmes stood suddenly, his movements smooth and unhurried. He crossed to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer into the quiet dusk outside. Then he turned away, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp with focus. "This is no longer merely a matter of stolen manuscripts," he said softly. "It is the silencing of knowledge by men who believe their secrets are worth more than any life." And Maynard was their first note of warning. His voice fell silent again, blending with the muted hum of London beyond the walls. I watched him stand there in the calm half-light of evening, his tall frame still as stone, feeling the quiet certainty that this melody, built of secrecy, power, and death, was only just beginning to reach its final devastating crescendo. Night fell swiftly over London that evening, bringing with it a hush that settled into the narrow streets like a dark velvet cloth. Fog drifted thick along Baker Street, rising in soft gray waves that blurred the yellow glow of gas lamps and muffled the rattle of passing hansom cabs. Inside our sitting room, Holmes stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight as he watched the shadows gather beyond the glass. He remained silent for some time, his posture calm and unhurried, before he turned away with quiet finality. Stepping to his writing desk, he removed a folded slip of paper from his notebook and handed it to me. It was a note addressed to Inspector Lestrade. "I have arranged for Murray to be taken into custody tonight," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying a deep certainty that filled the quiet room like the final chord of a resolved melody. He turned away, reaching for his coat and scarf, slipping them on with swift, efficient movements. I followed, pulling on my own coat as we stepped out into the cold, damp hush of the London night. Lestrade met us at the corner near Covent Garden, his boots dark with fog moisture, the lantern in his hand casting a soft golden glow across his lined, weary face. He nodded to Holmes without speaking, then gestured for two constables to follow him as they moved down the street towards Moray's townhouse. We arrived in near silence. The cream facade of the house loomed tall against the fog, its narrow windows dark and shuttered, despite the hour still being early. Lestrade climbed the steps and knocked with quiet authority, his gloved hand striking the polished wood 3 times. For several moments there was no sound but the whisper of mist curling along the railings. Finally, the door creaked open. The same maid who had admitted us earlier appeared in the dim entryway, her pale face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. He is upstairs, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking as her eyes flicked towards the darkened staircase behind her. "I tried to wake him for supper. He will not answer." Holmes moved past her swiftly, but with a calm, unhurried grace, Lestrade close behind. I followed them up the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath our feet in the quiet house. The fog drifted in through the uncurtained landing window, mingling with the faint scent of beeswax polish and lamp oil that lingered upon the cold air. At the end of the hall, Moray's study door stood ajar. Holmes pushed it open with a silent touch, and we stepped inside. The room was lit by a single lamp upon the desk, its dim glow illuminating the neat stacks of manuscripts and the polished brass clock ticking steadily beside them. Moray sat at the desk, his thin frame leaning forward slightly, his long, dark hair falling around his pale face. For a moment he appeared to be reading, his slender fingers resting upon an open folder as though poised to turn the page, but he was utterly still. The faint flicker of the lamp revealed the unnatural slackness of his jaw, the bluish tint spreading across his thin lips. Beside his open hand lay a small glass vial, empty but for a trace of clear liquid clinging to its inner walls. Holmes stepped forward calmly and reached down, lifting the folder from beneath Moray's lifeless hand. Underneath it lay a single slip of paper, folded once with precise care. Holmes opened it and read its words in a quiet, steady voice that seemed to blend with the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint rasp of fog against the window glass. The music stops before the final note. He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket before stepping back, his expression composed and unreadable. Lestrade let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he signaled for the constables to remain in the room until the coroner arrived. Holmes turned away from Moray's silent form and walked past me towards the doorway, his movements calm, his coat brushing softly against the edge of the carpet as he passed. Outside, the fog thickened into a quiet white wall against the window glass. Holmes paused at the threshold of the room, glancing back once at Morey's still body illuminated beneath the flickering lamplight. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger or sadness, but with the quiet resolve of a man who understood that a melody cut short left silence not as an ending, but as an unanswered question demanding its hidden resolution. Then he turned away and stepped into the darkened hallway, his footsteps silent as he moved towards the deeper truths that waited beyond this sudden, unfinished end. We returned to Baker Street late that night, the cold fog still clinging thick across the city, blurring the gas lamps into pale golden halos. The streets were quiet, but for the distant roll of carriage wheels and the soft echo of boots upon damp stone. Holmes walked ahead of me in silence, his tall frame moving with calm precision, his coat swirling lightly around his ankles as he climbed the familiar stone steps to our door. Inside, the sitting room felt warmer than usual, the fire glowing low in the grate, its gentle orange light flickering across the bookshelves, and scattered newspapers piled upon the small oak table near Holmes's armchair. Mrs. Hudson had left a fresh pot of tea upon the dining table, its scent of black leaves and faint bergamot rising into the quiet room, mingling with the subtle aroma of beeswax polish that lingered upon the floorboards. Holmes removed his coat and scarf with smooth, unhurried movements, and placed them upon the rack before crossing to his writing desk. He sat down heavily in the old leather chair, its frame creaking softly beneath his weight, and pulled the folded slip of paper from his coat pocket, the note found beneath Morey's lifeless hand. He unfolded it again, laying it flat upon the desk's blotter, smoothing its creased edges with quiet care. The words, "The music stops before the final note," lay in small slanted script across the pale parchment, each letter drawn with deliberate precision. Holmes stared at them for several minutes without moving, his gray eyes calm, yet alive with silent focus. Then, with a suddenness that startled me despite its quietness, he reached for Morey's scattered papers removed from the evidence envelope earlier that evening. He spread them neatly upon the desk, aligning each page edge with careful precision. Among them lay another coded sheet of music, its notes marked with small reversed symbols, just like Maynard's message. He studied it for a long moment, eyes flicking between the strange notes and the folded note from Morey. Then he drew his pencil from the pen tray and began writing rapidly in his notebook. The only sounds were the soft scratching of pencil upon paper, the quiet ticking of the mantel clock, and the muted hiss of the coal fire settling deeper into embers. Outside, the fog pressed heavily against the windows, turning the view into a gray-white void, silent and depthless. Within the warm lamplit room, Holmes continued his work with absolute focus. He filled page after page with quick notations, deciphering the reversed notes into letters, mapping them along rows and columns, crossing them with reference codes drawn from the cipher Maynard had used. Hours passed in near total silence, broken only by the faint rattle of coal settling in the grate and the occasional sigh as Holmes paused to adjust his calculations. I remained in my chair by the hearth, watching him, feeling the steady rhythm of his work settle into my chest, like the calming pulse of a quiet melody repeated beneath hushed candlelight. Finally, as dawn approached, and the first pale light crept into the fog-bound street beyond our window, Holmes set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. His face remained calm, eyes half closed, breathing deep and even. For a moment he sat there unmoving, as though listening to a sound only he could hear. Then he spoke in a voice that carried quiet certainty, low and edged with the gravity of revelation. The final message reads, "The order meets where the phoenix rises." I frowned, feeling the words settle into the silent room like a new, unanswered question. The Phoenix, Holmes, Covent Garden Theatre burned and was rebuilt. It was called the Phoenix Theatre once, was it not? Holmes opened his eyes, their gray depths alight with calm intensity. Precisely, Watson. The Phoenix Theatre. The old name before it reclaimed Covent Garden as its title. It is no mere poetic clue. It is their meeting place, their sanctuary, hidden in plain sight. He closed his notebook gently, pressing his long fingers upon its cover with silent finality. Outside, the fog lightened slightly into pale silver as dawn approached, revealing the dim outlines of chimney stacks and window panes blurred with condensation. Within the quiet warmth of Baker Street, the truth lay written before us, silent and waiting. Holmes rose from his chair, tall and composed, his posture carrying the calm readiness of a man who understood that the melody of this mystery was not yet complete. Its final notes waited in darkness, hidden among shadows, where music and death intertwined beyond the reach of ordinary men, but not beyond him. Morning arrived heavy with fog that refused to lift, smothering London in a gray hush that seemed to still even the echo of footsteps on the damp pavements. Holmes stood before the window, his tall frame outlined against the pale light that seeped reluctantly through the glass. In his hand he held his notebook open to the final decoded line. The order meets where the phoenix rises. He remained silent for several minutes, eyes distant yet focused, the fog beyond the window merging with the calm steel gray of his gaze. The gas lamp flickered beside him, casting a quiet glow across his sharp features and illuminating the thin plume of steam rising from the tea Mrs. Hudson had left upon the small table near the hearth. Finally, he closed the notebook with precise care and turned towards me. His voice, when it came, carried its usual quiet certainty, edged with a calm urgency that tightened the air between us. Watson, the Phoenix Theatre was the name given to Covent Garden after its reconstruction following the fire of 1732. Though it reclaimed the title Royal Opera House in later decades, its old name remains alive among certain circles. I nodded, feeling the subtle chill of anticipation trace along my spine as I rose from my chair by the hearth and reached for my coat. The coal fire burned low behind me, filling the room with its quiet, soothing warmth, but the resolve in Holmes's voice cut through that comfort with calm precision. We rode in silence through streets still thick with dawn fog. Carriage wheels hissed along damp stone, and the soft clip of horses' hooves echoed along deserted lanes lined with locked shop fronts. As we approached Covent Garden, the gas lamps glowed faintly in the grayness, illuminating the tall colonnades that loomed like silent sentinels around the square. Holmes stepped down from the carriage with smooth efficiency, his coat swirling lightly around his ankles as he paused upon the pavement. The vast theater loomed ahead, its imposing columns reaching into the fog, the upper windows dark and curtained, each pane reflecting the pale glow of street lamps like silent eyes watching the deserted square below. He walked forward with quiet purpose, each footfall echoing softly against the wide stone steps as he approached the side entrance where stagehands and suppliers came and went unnoticed by the elegant patrons who entered through the grand front doors. I followed closely, feeling the heavy hush of morning settle around us as we stepped beneath the archway into the narrow passage lined with stacked crates and empty lantern hooks. Holmes paused before a small wooden door reinforced with dark iron bands. He laid his hand lightly upon its handle and turned to me, his gray eyes calm yet alight with silent certainty. "They will not meet in the public halls, Watson," he said softly. "Their gatherings require secrecy, acoustics, and shadow. The old backstage passages beneath this theater hold more than props and forgotten set pieces. They hold rooms carved from stone centuries ago, hidden from the eyes of any who do not know where to look." He turned the handle and stepped through, the door creaking open upon silent darkness beyond. The air within was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of old wood, dust, and rosin that drifted up from the hidden depths below. We walked forward into the quiet gloom, the faint glow of dawn fading behind us as Holmes lit a small lantern from the wall bracket near the entryway. The corridor sloped downward at a gentle angle, its stone floor worn smooth by generations of quiet footsteps. Narrow alcoves lined the passage, each holding crates marked with faded opera titles and wooden trunks sealed with rusting padlocks. The lantern cast a small circle of flickering gold light ahead, revealing thin strands of cobweb drifting lazily across arched brickwork and old gas pipes bolted to the low ceiling. Holmes moved with measured calm, his tall frame stooped slightly to avoid the iron beams that crossed the passage at intervals. His eyes scanned each alcove, each door recessed into the curved walls, his footsteps silent upon the cold stone. I followed close behind, feeling the quiet tension coil deeper into my chest as we descended further into darkness, lit only by the thin circle of lantern light that shifted and danced upon ancient bricks. Finally, Holmes paused before a heavy wooden door reinforced with dark iron bands. Its hinges were broad and black with age, the iron handle polished smooth by countless hands over the decades. Upon its center was carved a small emblem, two crossed violin bows beneath a stylized mask of porcelain white. He turned back to me, his gray eyes sharp yet calm in the flickering lantern glow. The faint hush of underground air drifted past us, carrying the quiet scent of rosin, old paint, and the deeper earthy cold of stone that had not felt daylight in centuries. "Here, Watson," he said in a low, steady voice, "beyond this door lies the true performance. Not a requiem for an audience, but a gathering hidden for 200 years. Their music demands silence from all who hear it, or their lives in its place." He reached for the iron handle, his gloved fingers curling around it with calm certainty. As he pushed it open, the hinges groaned softly, and the darkness within shifted with the faint echo of distant, haunting notes. Music played not for applause, but for power. We stepped forward into that silent, waiting darkness, knowing the final hidden movements of this unfinished melody were about to reveal themselves in full. The door creaked open with a slow, reluctant sigh, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Holmes lifted the lantern higher, its flickering glow spilling across rough stone steps worn smooth by centuries of hidden footsteps. The air was cool and dry, scented faintly of rosin, old wood, and the deeper earthy chill of brickwork untouched by daylight. He stepped forward without hesitation, his tall frame moving with quiet certainty as he began to descend. I followed, feeling the cold settle deeper into my coat sleeves, the echo of each step reverberating softly up the narrow stairwell. Above us, the muffled sounds of early morning Covent Garden faded until only silence remained, wrapped around us like a heavy, soundless curtain. At the foot of the staircase, the passage opened into a long corridor lined with rough stone walls. Thin iron gas pipes ran along the ceiling beams, their surfaces blackened with age and smoke residue. Here and there, small alcoves opened off the main passage, each containing stacked crates marked with faded opera company logos and tall wooden panels painted with fragments of scenery, dark forests, marble columns, flickering torch sconces painted in careful trompe-l'oeil. Dust drifted in thin, silent streams through the lamplight, shifting with our passing footsteps. Holmes paused at each alcove, his eyes scanning the shadows with calm, attentive focus. His movements were unhurried, precise, as though he walked the quiet halls of a museum rather than the secret passages beneath London's grandest opera house. We passed locked storage rooms with heavy iron doors, their thick bolts sealed with rust, and narrow storage shelves lined with broken stage props, shattered violins, chipped ceramic masks, bent gilt candlesticks missing their wax candles. Finally, the corridor widened into a larger chamber. Holmes stopped, holding the lantern higher to illuminate the space. Before us lay the old backstage storage hall. Thick wooden support beams rose to meet the low brick ceiling, their dark surfaces gleaming dully in the lantern light. Along the far wall stood heavy crates stacked nearly to the ceiling, marked in curling faded script with German, Italian, and French shipping stamps dating back nearly 2 centuries. At the center of the room, narrow pathways wound between stacked trunks and cupboard furniture draped in moth-eaten black cloths. The scent here was stronger: rosin, old varnish, damp wood, and the faint, dry sweetness of paper aged beyond memory. Holmes moved forward with silent deliberation, his eyes scanning each crate and cloth-covered shape, as though reading a quiet language hidden within their shadows. He paused before a large trunk banded with black iron straps. The lock had been broken recently. Its metal edges were twisted and bent, leaving the trunk slightly ajar. Holmes set the lantern atop a nearby crate and crouched down, his long fingers pushing open the heavy lid with quiet care. Inside lay stacks of leather-bound folders, each tied with faded burgundy ribbon and stamped with seals of Austrian origin. Holmes reached in and lifted one, his eyes scanning the gold-lettered spine before placing it carefully aside. Beneath the folders, a large wrapped bundle filled nearly half the trunk's base. Its linen covering was stained with brown and ochre patches, its edges tied with coarse twine that had frayed in several places. Holmes slipped his penknife from his coat pocket and sliced the knots with precise, quiet movements. He folded back the linen, revealing a dark wooden case with tarnished brass hinges. Upon its lid, carved deeply into the surface, was the symbol of the Viana Order, 2 crossed violin bows beneath the stylized porcelain mask. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly as he traced the carving with his thumb. Then he unlatched the brass clasps and lifted the lid. Inside lay a manuscript wrapped in thin vellum sheets, their edges yellowed with age. Holmes lifted it gently into the lantern light. The front page bore a single title, written in black iron gall ink that had bled faintly into the fibers of the page: Requiem K626, Extended Lacrimosa, Vienna, 1791. His breath left him in a slow, quiet exhale. For a moment, silence surrounded us entirely, broken only by the faint hiss of the lantern flame and the soft drip of water somewhere deep within the stone walls. He closed the manuscript gently, returning it to its case before latching the clasps. Then he stood, lifting the lantern from the crate and turning towards the far end of the room, where another door stood, recessed into the stone. Its wooden surface was painted black and reinforced with thick iron bands, each rivet stamped with small looping emblems of a violin and bow. Holmes moved toward it with calm certainty, his footsteps silent upon the cold stone floor. He paused before the door, resting his free hand lightly upon its surface. The wood was scarred with thin cuts and worn smooth around the iron handle. For a long moment he stood there without moving, listening to something beyond the silent timber barrier. Then he turned to me, his gray eyes dark and still in the flickering lamplight. "Beyond this door, Watson," he said softly, "lies the true gathering. The hidden hall where the Order's final notes are played in secret. A place where music commands power and death ensures silence." He turned the iron handle slowly, and the lock slid back with a faint, reluctant click. As the door swung open upon silent hinges, the darkness within shifted, and a thin echo of distant music drifted out to meet us. A quiet melody played not for an audience, but for a hidden purpose that waited to reveal itself in full. We stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the deeper silence beyond. As we stepped through the door, the lantern's flickering glow revealed a wide underground chamber carved from old stone, its walls lined with arched niches that disappeared into shadow. The ceiling was low, supported by massive beams, blackened with centuries of candle smoke. The air was cold and still, holding the faint sense of resin, ancient varnish, and the dry mineral smell of earth, long untouched by sun or wind. Holmes paused at the threshold, his tall frame perfectly still, the lantern held high to illuminate the scene before us. At the center of the chamber stood 20 figures arranged in a broad circle. They wore black robes that draped to the floor, sleeves hanging loose around their wrists. Their faces were hidden behind smooth porcelain masks, each painted with thin black lines radiating outward from the eyes like stylized sunbursts. The masks glowed faintly in the lantern light, reflecting pale against the deep black of their robes. In the middle of this silent gathering, upon a raised wooden dais, stood a single man dressed in a long, dark coat cut in an old Viennese style, its high collar rising nearly to his ears. His hair was thin and gray, combed back from a narrow forehead, and his face, though partially obscured by shadow, carried the pale, pinched stillness of a man born into cold stone halls and silent music rooms. In his left hand, he held a thin black baton raised slightly above a small quartet seated before him, 2 violinists, a violist, and a cellist, their heads bowed low over their instruments. The quiet notes of the Dies Irae drifted through the hall, each phrase echoing softly against the stone arches, merging into a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate within my chest. The music was slow, weighted, with an intensity that pressed upon the mind, drawing it downwards into some hidden depth. The bow strokes were precise, the tone thin but sharp, each note slicing clean through the silent cold of the underground air. Holmes remained silent beside me, his eyes scanning each masked figure with calm, unhurried focus. His breath moved evenly, rising as faint mist in the cold chamber. The lantern flame bent and flickered with each quiet draft of underground air, sending shifting shadows across the stone floor. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, leaving only the music and the flickering light to measure its passing. The conductor lowered his baton slightly, and the quartet fell silent in perfect unison. The sudden hush seemed to deepen the darkness between the arches, as though the music had been holding back some greater silence that now spread across the hall. The conductor turned slowly towards us, his thin face emerging fully into the lantern's glow. He regarded Holmes with eyes so pale they seemed nearly colorless in the dim light. His lips curved into a small, tight smile that did not touch the cold precision of his gaze. When he spoke, his voice was soft, calm, and edged with a quiet confidence that carried clearly across the silent chamber. "We knew you would come, Mr. Holmes." The robed figures did not turn to look at us, but I saw their masked faces shift slightly, as though listening for Holmes's reply. The conductor lowered his baton fully, allowing it to hang from his fingertips, its polished wood gleaming dully under the lantern glow. "But you must understand," the conductor continued, his voice remaining soft and even, "you cannot stop what we do here. Music commands the soul more deeply than any law ever written. Its power transcends kings, governments, and the small concerns of men." Holmes did not respond immediately. He remained still, his gray eyes locked upon the conductor, watching him with calm, silent attention. Then, slowly, he lowered the lantern until its light illuminated only the stone floor at our feet, casting the circle of masked figures into deep shadow. His voice, when it came, was quiet and edged with steel. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but even the greatest music falls silent when its last note is played." The conductor's smile widened slightly, though his pale eyes remained cold and distant. He raised the baton again, this time not towards the musicians, but in a small gesture of dismissal. "Then let us see, Mr. Holmes, whether you live to hear that final note." At his signal, the masked figures shifted silently, their robes whispering against the cold stone as they turned towards us, forming a silent wall of dark fabric and white porcelain. The lantern flame flickered violently in the sudden movement of air, casting the chamber into shifting shadows that danced across the arched walls like silent, watching spirits. Holmes lifted the lantern higher, his posture tall and unflinching as the circle closed in around us. The quiet scrape of their approaching steps merged with the echo of the final, unfinished chord still vibrating through the chamber, a melody cut short before its final resolution. And in that unresolved silence lay a tension as deep and dangerous as death itself. The masked figures stood silently around us, their robes falling in still black folds that brushed against the cold stone floor. Holmes held the lantern high, its trembling glow casting pale reflections across the porcelain masks, each painted sunburst flickering with each shift of flame. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, weighted with the echoes of the Dies Irae still lingering in the silent arches above. The conductor lowered his baton fully and stepped down from the small wooden dais, his thin shoes making no sound against the stones as he approached. His pale eyes remained fixed upon Holmes, the tight smile still curving his narrow lips without reaching the distant coldness within his gaze. He stopped only a few paces before Holmes, tilting his head slightly as he regarded him in silence. The flickering lamplight revealed fine lines carved deep into his gaunt face, lines etched by years of tension and quiet obsession rather than time alone. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm, each word pronounced with deliberate precision that cut through the silent air, like the bow strokes of the quartet's final broken melody. "You see now, Mr. Holmes, why your efforts have been wasted. We are not merely collectors nor criminals to be unmasked in some London court. We are guardians of power, older than the laws you serve." Holmes remained perfectly still, his tall frame relaxed, yet poised with quiet readiness, his gray eyes locked upon the conductor's pale gaze, unblinking, unflinching. I stood just behind him, the faint lantern glow brushing against my coat sleeve as I felt my heart pound with a quiet force against my ribs. The conductor's smile widened slightly, the thin skin at his cheeks pulling tight against his sharp bones. "Mozart understood," he continued softly. "Music is not merely beauty, it is command. Harmony can soothe an infant to sleep, summon armies to slaughter, or bind a soul so completely that freedom itself becomes meaningless." He gestured with his thin baton towards the robed figures surrounding us. Their masked faces remained turned towards Holmes, each painted sunburst catching small reflections of light, like silent, watchful eyes. "We are the Order," the conductor said, his voice lowering further into a quiet that forced the ear to strain and listen. "The Viana Order. We do not care for applause, nor fame, nor your small legal truths. We care only for the preservation and control of music that was never meant for mortal ears." He paused, his pale gaze narrowing slightly as he tilted his head, studying Holmes as though observing a specimen under glass. "And you, Mr. Holmes, you would silence us, yes? But you do not understand. This is not a mystery to solve. This is power to accept. A power beyond kings, beyond courts, beyond your clever deductions and your little triumphs." For a long moment silence filled the hall. The flickering lantern flame cast shifting shadows along the arched walls, the robed figures unmoving within their heavy cloaks. I felt the cold of the stone beneath my boots, rising through the soles to settle into my bones. The conductor's voice, so calm and precise, seemed to vibrate still within the chamber's hush, each word echoing like a fading note along the ancient bricks. Finally Holmes spoke, his voice as quiet as the conductor's, but edged with a calm certainty that cut through the darkness like a scalpel through flesh. "You mistake me," he said softly. "I do not seek to silence you. I seek only to end your hold upon others." The conductor's smile did not fade. Instead, he stepped forward another pace, closing the distance between them so that only a breath separated his pale, sharp face from Holmes's calm, unflinching gaze. "And that, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "is why you must now join Maynard in silence." He raised his baton swiftly. At the same moment, the masked figures around us moved as one, their robes whispering sharply against the cold stone as they stepped forward into the lantern's glow. The porcelain masks loomed close, their painted sunbursts flickering with shifting shadows, silent and watchful as the circle closed tightly around us. Holmes did not move. His gray eyes remained locked upon the conductor's pale, distant gaze. His breathing was slow and even, his shoulders relaxed, as though standing before an orchestra he alone could hear, awaiting the downstroke of a final fatal chord. In that hushed darkness, lit only by the trembling glow of the single lantern, I felt the melody of this mystery reach its deepest silence. The silence before a crescendo powerful enough to either shatter the shadows forever or consume us entirely within them. The conductor's baton remained poised in the dim lantern glow, hovering in the silent air between Holmes and his masked adversary. Around us, the circle of robed figures stood utterly still, their porcelain masks glowing faintly beneath the flickering light. The hush that filled the underground hall was so deep it pressed upon the ears, a silence so complete it seemed almost to throb with its own hidden pulse. Holmes did not move, his eyes locked upon the conductor's pale gaze, reading each subtle shift of breath, each faint tightening of his thin lips. Then, without warning, the lantern flame flickered violently as a cold underground draft swept through the chamber, rattling the iron hinges of the distant doors and sending shadows leaping across the stone walls. Holmes moved in that same instant. With sudden, precise force, he swung the lantern low in his right hand, smashing it against the stone floor before the conductor's feet. Glass shattered with a sharp crystalline crack, and hot oil sprayed outward in a burst of brilliant flame that roared briefly into the darkness. The masked figures recoiled instinctively, their robes sweeping back as the flames licked across the ground, smoke billowing upwards into the low ceiling beams. I lunged forward, feeling Holmes's hand grip my coat sleeve with powerful urgency as he pulled me toward the far side of the hall. The masked figures were shouting now, their calm silence dissolving into sudden chaos as flames crackled across spilled oil, their pale porcelain masks glowing orange in the shifting firelight. The conductor stepped back from the flames, his baton raised as though to command order from the sudden chaos. Holmes released my arm and moved swiftly towards him, tackling him with silent, controlled force. The baton clattered to the stone floor as Holmes forced him back against the dais, his thin frame collapsing under Holmes's taller, stronger build. Around us, robed figures scrambled in confusion, some retreating towards the narrow side passages, others seizing crates and instruments stacked along the stone walls. The fire was spreading only slowly along the oil streaks, but thick smoke already curled into the cold air, carrying with it the acrid scent of burning rosin and varnish. Holmes turned to me, his voice calm and sharp even in the chaos. "Watson, now, we move." He pulled me away from the dais, stepping over the conductor's crumpled form as the man gasped for breath, clutching at his bruised ribs. We ran along the edge of the hall, past crates marked with old Viennese stamps, past cello cases stacked in leaning towers, past draped cloths covering broken stage props. The smoke grew thicker, swirling around us as masked figures coughed and stumbled in confusion, their dark robes sweeping sparks across the stone floor. At the far end of the chamber, Holmes found a narrow door half hidden behind a draped black velvet stage curtain. He pulled it open with swift force, revealing a small stone corridor lit by flickering gas lamps, set into iron brackets along the walls. The cold air here was clearer, and the corridor sloped upwards at a gentle incline. Holmes turned back briefly, his gray eyes scanning the smoky hall behind us. Among the chaos, I saw robed figures dragging leather cases and parchment folders towards an archway that led deeper underground. Others fled past us into side passages, their porcelain masks glowing ghost-like in the dim gaslight. On the floor near the dais lay several dropped satchels. Holmes reached down swiftly, snatching one up before pulling me fully into the corridor. The satchel's weight shifted with the dense solidity of bound paper and metal. We ran together up the narrow stone passage, boots echoing along its arched ceiling as the air grew clearer with each stride. Behind us, distant shouts rose within the hall, mingled with the muffled clatter of crates toppling and the quiet roar of flames spreading along the oil-slicked floor. The smell of burning wood and varnish drifted after us in thin, bitter currents as we climbed higher through the old backstage passages. Finally, we emerged into a silent storage loft, lit only by the gray dawn seeping through high, narrow windows. Dust motes drifted in the cold light, swirling around ropes, pulleys, and stacked wooden flats painted with scenery of palaces and cathedrals. Holmes paused, his chest rising and falling with steady control as he listened for any pursuing footsteps. There were none. He lowered the satchel to the floor and unbuckled its leather straps with swift, deliberate movements. Inside lay several thick folders bound with burgundy ribbon, their labels marked in looping German script, and beneath them a thin stack of folded contracts stamped with dark blue wax seals. Holmes flipped through them quickly, his eyes scanning each line with precise calm. Then he set them back into the satchel and rose, turning to me with a quiet certainty that cut through the cold air between us. "These are contracts for the sale of the extended Requiem manuscript," he said softly. "Private buyers in Munich, Vienna, and Leipzig. They plan to disperse the music before the year's end." He lifted the satchel and slung it over his shoulder with a single fluid movement. His gray eyes were clear and sharp, reflecting the pale dawn light that streamed through the dusty loft windows. "Come, Watson, we must leave before the order regathers its purpose." Together we stepped out into the silent morning corridors of Covent Garden Theatre, leaving behind the hidden hall and its scattered shadows. Yet, as we walked, I felt the quiet certainty settle deeper into my chest. This melody was not yet finished. Its darkest chords had only just begun to sound. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, I sat at my small oak writing desk beneath the front window, the curtains drawn tight against the cold fog rolling off the Thames. The lamp flickered quietly beside me, casting its warm glow across the pages of my leather-bound journal. Outside, the muffled rumble of passing carriages drifted through the glass, mingling with the occasional distant bark of a dog or the sharp metallic clatter of a coal cart turning onto Marylebone Road. Holmes sat in his armchair by the hearth, the satchel recovered from the order resting unopened upon the small table at his elbow. The fire burned low, its orange glow casting soft, shifting light across his sharp features. He sat perfectly still, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in silent contemplation. I dipped my pen into the inkwell and began to write, the quiet scratch of the nib upon paper blending with the subtle hiss of the coal fire. My words emerged slowly, each line carrying the heavy truth of what we had uncovered. Tonight, Holmes saved a piece of music history from becoming a tool of blackmail, power, and silent death. The Requiem K626 extension lay hidden for centuries, guarded by men who believed its harmonies carried a force too deep and dark for the world to hear. To them, secrecy was not simply protection. It was power itself. I paused, my gaze drifting towards Holmes as he sat silent before the fire, its light flickering gently against his lined brow and angular jaw. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, yet in the stillness of his posture, I saw a quiet tension. The same tension I had seen each time we stepped away from a solved case into the silent aftermath of its revelations. As I watched him, I realized that the world saw Holmes as the master of logic and deduction, untouched by emotion or moral conflict. Yet I knew him as a man who bore the burden of each truth he revealed, carrying it silently within himself like a hidden wound. His mind dissected mysteries with clean precision, but his soul felt their weight in ways he never spoke aloud. I dipped my pen again and continued writing, the ink pooling smoothly into each looping letter. Tonight, I saw in Holmes's eyes the shadow of something deeper. Perhaps it was sorrow at seeing beauty twisted into power. Perhaps it was anger at a secret society that believed human life worth less than a sheet of manuscript paper. Or perhaps it was something quieter and darker, an understanding that genius, whether in music or in the mind, is always a blade with two edges. The power to create beauty carries within it the same force to enforce silence forever. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending thin sparks drifting up into the soot-blackened flue. Holmes remained unmoving, his breathing calm and steady, as though listening to some silent melody drifting just beyond the reach of mortal ears. I closed my journal gently, setting my pen aside as I leaned back in my chair. Outside, the fog thickened across Baker Street, blurring the yellow glow of the gas lamps into faint, trembling halos. Within our warm, lamp-lit rooms, the quiet hush settled deep and calm around us, carrying with it the knowledge that this case, like the silent echoes of Mozart's lost Lacrimosa, would remain forever unfinished within the hidden shadows of human history. Yet as I watched Holmes sitting there in the firelight, his tall frame folded into silent contemplation, I felt a quiet certainty fill my chest. Whatever shadows this world held, however dark its final unfinished melodies, there would always remain at least one man who would follow them into their deepest silence, not for fame nor power, but for the pure truth that lay hidden within their quietest notes. Dawn had not yet broken when I woke to the soft sound of music drifting through the rooms of Baker Street. The fire in the hearth had burned down to pale gray ash, leaving the sitting room dim but for the faint flicker of a single lamp upon Holmes's writing desk. I rose quietly from my narrow bed and stepped into the sitting room, pulling my dressing gown tighter against the chill that seeped through the window panes. Holmes sat at the piano, his tall frame leaning slightly forward, shoulders relaxed, fingers moving lightly over the chipped ivory keys. He was playing the Lacrimosa. The melody rose soft and fragile within the quiet room, each note emerging from his touch with a calm deliberation that carried both sorrow and quiet grace. It was not the public performance of a virtuoso, nor the analytical rendering of a scholar. It was a man communing with a melody that carried within it everything he understood about life and death, beauty and silence, the final edge of genius pressed forever against its own ending. The gray dawn pressed softly against the window glass behind him, diffusing the weak morning light across his sharp features. His eyes remained half-closed as he played, lashes casting faint shadows against his cheeks. His breathing was slow and even, chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm with the gentle progression of the chords. Outside, the city remained silent under the final darkness before sunrise. No carriages rattled along Baker Street. No vendors called their wares. The gas lamps burned pale and solitary along the pavement, illuminating only the drifting fog curling between their iron posts. As I stood there, watching him play, I felt a heaviness settle into my chest, not of fear or sorrow, but of a deep, silent understanding that this moment, this fragile dawn-lit melody, revealed something in Holmes that the world would never see. A quiet communion with a truth so absolute it could neither be spoken nor denied, only played softly in a silent room before the city awoke. He reached the extended final measures, those lost phrases hidden for centuries within the Requiem's unfinished pages. His fingers moved with precise grace, shaping each note into its perfect place within the silent architecture of the music. The low chords vibrated faintly through the wooden floors, rising to merge with the soft echo of fog-muted bells ringing the hour at St. Mary's nearby. Holmes did not look up as he played the last quiet chord. The notes lingered in the dim lamplight, drifting through the silent sitting room before dissolving into the cold dawn air. He remained seated, head bowed slightly, his long fingers resting motionless upon the keys. "Even in death, Watson," he murmured softly, his voice blending with the hush of the unlit morning, "music still commands us all." He closed the piano lid with quiet care, the faint thud of wood upon wood settling into the room like the final beat of a silent heart. Then he sat there for a long moment, gazing down at his folded hands before rising with calm grace. As he stepped away into the gray-lit kitchen to prepare his morning tea, I remained standing in the silent sitting room, the echo of the Lacrimosa still vibrating deep within my chest. Outside, the first pale glow of sunrise broke through the fog, illuminating the city in its quiet, unfinished beauty. And in that dim, drifting light, I understood that music, like truth, like genius, like Holmes himself, could never be silenced. Its final note would always remain hidden somewhere beyond the reach of death, echoing forever in the quiet places of this world. As the first warmth of sunrise spread softly across Baker Street, filling the sitting room with its pale golden light, the world outside began to wake in gentle hushes. A distant carriage rolling down the street, a milkman's quiet whistle carried on the morning breeze, the faint flutter of pigeons settling upon window ledges. Holmes had retreated to his armchair by the hearth, closing his eyes for a brief moment of silent thought, while I sat at my writing desk, feeling the last notes of the Lacrimosa still echoing within my chest like a memory too deep to fade. And so, dear listener, as this quiet mystery finds its closing chord, I invite you to let go of each unraveled clue and softened shadow. Allow your breath to deepen, your shoulders to relax, and your mind to settle into calm silence, just as Holmes now rests in his quiet contemplation beside the dying fire. The echoes of forgotten music remain, drifting beyond the walls of Baker Street into the gentle dawn. Let them carry you into peaceful sleep tonight, knowing that in every hidden shadow of this world there is always light waiting to be revealed, softly, patiently, like the first golden rays of morning. May your dreams be calm and your rest deep, until you wake once more to a quiet world renewed.